I need people to understand something before I get into this. I don't tell this story to impress anyone. There's no bravado in what I'm about to say. In fact, if anything, it still makes me uneasy to think about it. Not in the way that a bad dream makes you uneasy when you first wake up and it fades within minutes. I mean the kind of unease that never really leaves, the kind that you've learned to carry quietly like a stone in your pocket. My name is Corporal Dennis Hargrove. I'm 43 years old, recently retired after 19 years with the United States Army Corps of Engineers. My specialty was field communications, the infrastructure that keeps an operational unit talking to the rest of the world. Radios, relay towers, fiber lines, satellite uplinks. If a unit went dark, I was the one they sent in to bring it back online. I was good at it. Exceptional, some of my supervising officers would say. And I'll be honest, that pride is what made what happened all the more difficult to process. Because the one time it truly mattered, the equipment wasn't the problem. The year was 2009 and I was deployed in a mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border. I won't name the exact area, some of that is still classified and some of it I simply prefer not to say out loud. What I can tell you is that it was remote, the kind of remote where you start to realize how much of modern life is just noise you've been filtering your whole existence. Up there, without it, you understand the silence in a completely different way. Our unit had been tasked with re-establishing a communications relay at an outpost that had gone quiet. FOB Marengo was a small forward operating base, maybe 40 personnel at full capacity, perched at roughly 9,000 feet elevation on a natural shelf of rock overlooking a valley the military used as a monitoring corridor. 3 days prior, all contact with FOB Marengo had ceased. No distress signal, no degradation in signal quality suggesting equipment failure. One moment it was there, and the next it simply wasn't. High Command assessed it as likely equipment failure due to the altitude and cold. I had been flown in from a larger base to assess and repair the relay. My escort was a 4-man security detail led by Sergeant Marcus Webb, a quiet man from rural Mississippi who had the particular kind of calm that only comes from having been in genuinely dangerous situations and surviving them. The other 3 were younger Alvarez, Hutchins, and a kid everyone called Penny because of the copper-colored hair he kept just barely inside regulation. The 5 of us rode a Chinook as far as the terrain would permit, then hiked the rest. 6 hours up a trail that had no business being called a trail. Webb navigated. I carried the diagnostic kit and the spare relay components. The landscape was extraordinary and brutal in equal measure, stone and wind, and a sky that felt closer than it had any right to be. We reached FOB Marengo at approximately 14:30 hours. And immediately, before any of us said a word, we all understood something was wrong. The outer perimeter was intact. The gate was closed, latched from the inside, no signs of a breach, no evidence of an attack, but the base was completely still. Not quiet, I want to make that distinction, because quiet implies absence of sound. What I mean is still the way a photograph is still. Everything was in its place, but the life had gone out of it. Webb signaled us into a tactical entry formation. We cleared the perimeter structures first, the watch post, the vehicle bay, the generator shed. Everything was in order, no signs of struggle. The generator was running, power was on, and that detail lodged itself in my mind almost immediately. If the generator was running and power was on, then my equipment failure theory had a serious problem. We found the personnel in the main barracks building. All of them. 37 soldiers, seated or lying as if they had simply stopped in the middle of whatever they were doing. A card game on one table, mid-hand. A man slumped over a letter he'd been writing. 2 soldiers on their bunks, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. None of them were responsive. Their breathing was shallow but present. Pulses faint but there. Webb immediately called in a medical emergency on his handset. I stood in the middle of that barracks and looked at those men and felt something I can only describe as wrongness. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're standing in a room and you can't identify what's out of place, but with absolute certainty that something is. Hargrove, Webb said, his voice low and even, get to the communications room, find out what happened to the relay. That's your job. Do your job. He was right. That was what I was there for. I picked up my kit and crossed the compound to the communications room, a reinforced structure near the center of the base. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. The equipment inside was, visually speaking, completely operational. Every indicator light showed green. The relay terminal was powered, connected, and showed a full signal lock. On paper, FOB Marengo was talking to the world just fine, and yet for 3 days no one had heard a word from them. I sat down at the primary console and ran a full diagnostic. Everything passed. I switched to manual broadcast and tried to reach our base. Nothing. Not static, not interference, just a complete and perfect silence on the other end of a connection that every instrument was telling me was open and functional. I tried the backup frequency, the emergency band, the satellite uplink. Each time the same result: technically connected, actually unreachable. I'd seen a lot of strange things in my time. Equipment that should have failed and didn't. Equipment that should have worked and didn't. But I had never seen a system that existed simultaneously in both states. That was not a technical failure I had a framework for. It was on my 4th or 5th attempt, I'd lost count, that I heard it. Not on the handset, not through the console speakers. It was coming from a secondary receiver mounted on the wall to my left, a unit I hadn't touched, a unit that wasn't even switched on. A voice. It was speaking English, which was the first thing that struck me. Clear, measured, without any of the characteristic distortion of long-range radio transmission. Like someone in the same room speaking into a cup. The words were deliberate, slightly too evenly spaced, the way someone sounds when they're reading from a page in a language that isn't quite native to them. Marengo, Marengo, report your status, report your status. I didn't move for several seconds. Then I leaned toward the unit and said carefully, "This is Corporal Hargrove, communication specialist on temporary assignment to FOB Marengo. Identify yourself and your unit." Silence. Then, "Report your status." "I just did. Who is this? What frequency are you broadcasting on?" "Report your status, Marengo." I reached over and physically checked the unit's power switch. Off. I checked the cable at the back. Disconnected. I have gone over this in my memory hundreds of times, and I cannot explain it in any technical terms that satisfy me. A disconnected, unpowered unit was receiving and, apparently, transmitting. I stepped back from the console and went outside to get Webb. I told him, as calmly and precisely as I could, what I had just experienced. He listened without expression. Then he said, "Show me." We went back in together. The unit was silent now. Webb looked at it, looked at me, and I could tell from his face that he had decided to suspend judgment rather than form an opinion he'd have to defend. That was the kind of man he was. "Keep working," he said. "I'm going to check on the men." I spent the next 2 hours at that console running every test I knew. I pulled the maintenance logs, cross-checked the installation records, traced every cable by hand. I found nothing wrong. I also found on page 3 of the base's communications log something that stopped me cold. The last entry was time-stamped 3 days prior, 2 hours before contact was lost. The operator, a specialist named Torres, whose handwriting I could see slumped over that letter in the barracks, had written 4 words in the log in addition to the standard status notation. Voice on receiver 3. That was all. No description, no follow-up. And then, 2 hours later, 37 men stopped functioning. Webb extracted us at 1800 hours when the medevac arrived for the personnel. I was the last one out of the communications room. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the equipment, all of it still showing green, still showing connected, still talking to somewhere that wasn't answering. I filed a full technical report. I was thorough and honest, including the detail about the disconnected receiver. That section of my report was, I later learned, redacted before it reached the final documentation. I was told this was standard procedure for unverifiable anomalies. The personnel from FOB Marengo regained consciousness within 48 hours of evacuation. None of them remembered anything after approximately 2200 hours on the night before contact was lost. There was no medical explanation identified for their condition. I know this because Webb kept in contact with me for years after, and he made it his business to follow the case. He called me in the spring of 2011 with one last update. A signals intelligence team had been sent back to FOB Marengo 6 months after our visit. They had found nothing unusual. The base had been decommissioned and stripped of equipment, everything removed and catalogued, except for the secondary receiver on the wall of the communications room. That unit wasn't in any of the removal manifests. It wasn't in the inventory records from our original visit, either. I checked my own documentation twice after Webb told me. No serial number, no installation date, no procurement record. As far as the official paperwork was concerned, it had never been there. As far as I was concerned, I had spent 45 minutes in a room with it, listening to it ask me a question I still don't have an answer to. I retired in 2022. I live in Central Virginia now, quiet part of the state, lots of trees. My kids have never heard this story. My wife has once years ago, and she didn't push for more details, and I appreciated that about her. Sometimes late at night, if the house is very still, I'll catch myself listening in a way I can't quite explain. Not for anything specific, just listening. The way you do when you can feel that a room isn't quite empty, but you can't yet find what's in it with you. I don't know what was broadcasting on that receiver. I don't know what happened to those 37 men in the hours they can't account for. I don't know what specialist Torres heard that made him write those 4 words and nothing else. What I know is this. The equipment was working perfectly. Everything was connected. The line was open. And whatever was on the other end of it was patient enough to still be asking. We continue. My name is Calvin. I'm 38 years old. I work as a long-haul freight dispatcher out of a small logistics company in western Pennsylvania, and I want to be upfront with you right now. I've told this story exactly twice in my life. Once to my brother, who laughed and told me I'd been sleeping too little, and once to a coworker who stopped asking me questions halfway through and just sort of stared at his coffee until I stopped talking. So I figured maybe the right audience for something like this isn't the people who know me. Maybe it's strangers. I'm not a superstitious person. I want that on the record. I grew up in a pretty no-nonsense household where we weren't allowed to talk about things we couldn't prove, and I carried that with me into adulthood. I believe in things I can touch and see and verify, or at least I used to. This happened about 4 years ago, late October. I was driving back from a regional freight summit in Erie, basically a 2-day conference where a bunch of dispatchers and logistics managers sit in hotel conference rooms and talk about fuel costs and routing software, which is every bit as exciting as it sounds. I'd taken my own car because I was planning to stop and see my uncle on the way back. But he'd called me that morning and cancelled because he wasn't feeling well, so I was just heading straight home. The route I prefer between Erie and my place cuts through a stretch of 2-lane state road called Route 9. If you're from that part of Pennsylvania, you know it. It's one of those roads that doesn't have much on it, just farmland on both sides and the occasional grain silo. No streetlights except in the small towns. And by late October, the trees have dropped most of their leaves, so at night it has this raw, skeletal look to it that I've always found kind of peaceful, actually. I like driving at night. The road feels like it belongs to you. I left Erie around 9 in the evening. I wasn't tired. I'd slept well at the hotel, and I had a thermos of coffee and the radio going. The drive should have been about 2.5 hours, totally routine. About 40 minutes in, I was on a stretch of Route 9 I knew well, between 2 small towns called Millfield and Cordell, when my headlights caught someone on the shoulder of the road. A man, walking in the same direction I was driving, wearing what looked like dark work clothes and a jacket. No reflective gear, just walking along the edge of the road in the dark, which, honestly, is not that unusual out there. You see the occasional person walking between towns. I slowed down as I passed him out of habit. I always do when there's a pedestrian on a dark road, and in that second where my headlights fully lit him up, I noticed he was an older gentleman. Maybe late 60s or early 70s, with a weathered face and grey hair, carrying nothing, no bag, no phone in his hand, just walking. I drove past him, got maybe a quarter mile down the road, and I want you to understand that this is the part that bothered me for completely rational reasons before anything strange happened. I started feeling guilty. It was 40 degrees out. He was old. He had no bag, which meant he wasn't on some kind of walking trip. What was an elderly man doing on a dark stretch of Route 9 at 9:30 at night with nothing in his hands? I pulled over, sat there for a second. I've seen enough bad situations in my line of work to know that sometimes you regret the help you don't give, so I put the car in reverse and backed up until my taillights were near him. He was still walking, steady pace, didn't seem startled when I stopped. I rolled down my window and said, "Hey, you need a ride anywhere? It's cold out." He stopped walking and turned to look at me. Up close, he had one of those faces that looked like it had seen a lot of weather. Deep lines, calm eyes, unhurried expression. He said, "Heading to Cordell." Cordell was only about 12 miles ahead of me, directly on my route home. I told him to get in. He thanked me quietly and got in the passenger seat, and we drove. He buckled his seatbelt, which for some reason I remember clearly just the small mechanical click of it. I asked him his name and he said it was Dennis. I told him mine and he nodded. Not unfriendly, just quiet. I offered him coffee from my thermos and he declined politely. For the first few minutes we drove in silence and I didn't push it. Some people aren't talkers and that's fine. The radio was on low, some classic rock station. The road was empty. Everything was normal. Then I asked, mainly just to fill the silence, what had brought him out this way. He said he'd been visiting someone. I said, on foot? And he said, most of the way, yes. That was a little odd. Millfield was 6 or 7 miles back, but I let it go. People do long walks. He seemed healthy enough. I asked if the person he visited was doing all right, and he paused before answering. Just a brief pause, a second or two, but I noticed it. Then he said, she's going to be fine. She just needed to hear it from someone. Something about the way he said that stuck with me, but I didn't press it. We drove maybe another 3 or 4 minutes in silence, and then he said, without me asking anything, you're going to want to slow down after the mill. I knew what he meant. There's an old grain processing facility about 2 miles before Cordell, and after it the road dips into a low curve that gets icy early in the season. I'd driven it hundreds of times, but I hadn't mentioned it and I hadn't told him anything about my route or that I knew the road. Tourists didn't know about that curve. Only people who drove it regularly knew you needed to watch it. You know the road? I asked. He just said, I know it. I noted it and kept driving, and we reached the outskirts of Cordell about 10 minutes later. I asked him where he needed to be dropped off, and he said the corner of Main and Aldrich would be fine. I knew that corner. There was a small diner and a pharmacy and not much else. I pulled up to it. He thanked me again, got out, and I watched him in my rearview mirror as I pulled back onto the road. He was just standing on the corner, not going into any building, not walking further, just standing there. I drove home, made good time, slept fine. The next morning I was back in the office and I mentioned to my coworker Laura that I'd given a ride to an old man on Route 9 the night before. She asked me to describe him. I told her older gray hair, weathered face, quiet, said his name was Dennis, going to Cordell. Laura looked at me for a moment, then she said, was he wearing dark work clothes, like a heavy jacket? I said yes. She got a strange look on her face and said she needed to tell me something. She had grown up in Cordell, her family was from there. And she told me that there was an old man named Dennis Hoare who had lived in Cordell his entire life, had worked at that grain mill his whole career, knew every turn of Route 9 the way you know the layout of your own house. He had died 6 years ago. I told her she must be thinking of someone else. She pulled out her phone and showed me an obituary she found. It was brief small-town paper, basic information. Dennis Hoare, age 71, lifelong resident of Cordell, survived by one daughter. The photo was grainy, black and white, the kind of quality you get from a decades-old newspaper image that's been scanned and uploaded, but the face was familiar. I sat with that for a long time. I'm still sitting with it, honestly. I've gone back and forth on it more times than I can count. Bad lighting, tired eyes, resemblance, coincidence. My brain generates a new rational explanation about every 3 weeks, and I hold on to it for a while, and then something about it doesn't quite add up, and I'm back to not knowing. But here's the thing that I can't explain away, and I've tried. About a week after that drive, Laura mentioned to me that she'd called her mother in Cordell just to check in, like she does every week. Her mother had mentioned offhandedly that she'd run into an old family friend at the pharmacy, a woman named Ruth who was in her 80s, lived alone out near Millfield, and had apparently been having a hard few months. Some health scares, some loneliness, the kind of slow difficulty that elderly people living alone sometimes go through. Ruth had told Laura's mother that she'd had the strangest feeling of peace a few weeks ago, that she'd been sitting in her kitchen very late one night, feeling as low as she'd felt in years, and something shifted. She described it as being like someone had reminded her that she was going to be all right. She couldn't explain it, she just said it felt like someone had come by. I haven't driven Route 9 at night since then. That's not because I'm afraid of it. I want to be clear about that. It's a road I know and I've driven hundreds of times and I'll drive it again. It's just that every time I think about doing it at night, I find myself wondering what I'd do if I saw someone walking on the shoulder again. And I genuinely don't know what I would do. I don't know if I'd stop. I don't know if I'd be able to explain afterward what I'd picked up. My brother still thinks I was overtired. Maybe he's right. I've been going back and forth on that for 4 years now, and I'm no closer to an answer than I was the night I drove home and slept like nothing had happened. But I'll tell you this, I've been driving for over 20 years and I've never once, before or since, felt the specific feeling I felt when I watched that man get out of my car at that corner and just stand there in the cold. Not scared, not relieved, just this strange hollow stillness like the air in a room right after someone has left it. I think about Dennis Hoare more than makes any sense for a man I supposedly only met once, maybe less than once. We continue. My name is Gerald. I've been working as a night security guard for about 11 years now, and for the last 4 of those I've been stationed at the Hargrove and Lane building, a 22-story office complex in the financial district of downtown Cincinnati. I won't give you the exact address, partly because I still work there, and partly because I'm not sure my supervisors would appreciate me talking about any of this publicly. My shift runs from 9 in the evening until 5 in the morning. The building is almost entirely empty by 6 or 6:30 each evening, though on busy weeks, especially during quarterly reports and tax season, you'll find the occasional analyst or junior attorney burning the midnight oil on the upper floors. That's normal. That's expected. You get used to the sounds of a building that's technically empty but never truly quiet. What I'm going to describe took place over the span of roughly 3 weeks about 2 years ago. I've told this story once before to my brother-in-law over a few beers and he laughed it off. That was the last time I mentioned it to anyone. The Hargrove building has 6 elevators. 4 are standard passenger elevators that serve floors 1 through 22. One is a freight elevator that runs from the basement loading dock to the 14th floor, where a large corporate kitchen and event space is located. The 6th elevator is a service elevator in the east wing, and it only goes from the ground floor to the 18th floor. That's where the building's mechanical room is. HVAC systems, the main electrical panel, water risers. Maintenance uses it a couple of times a week. On nights I was on duty, I used it occasionally when I needed to check on the mechanical room after an alarm or a reported issue. I mention all this because the elevator arrangement matters later. My routine was simple. I do a patrol sweep of the lobby and the first 3 floors at the start of my shift, then another around midnight covering floors 4 through 12, and a final sweep of the upper floors around 3 in the morning. In between, I sat at the front desk, monitored the cameras, signed in any late-night deliveries, and kept a log of anything unusual. The job was quiet. That was fine with me. The first thing I noticed, and I didn't think much of it at the time, was on a Tuesday in early November. I was doing my midnight sweep on the 9th floor, which is occupied by a mid-sized accounting firm. The lights in that corridor auto-dim after 8 p.m., so the hallway was running on the ambient emergency setting, which gives everything a faint blue-gray tone. I was walking the east corridor when I heard the elevator chime. The service elevator, the east wing one. I stopped. The service elevator doesn't chime. It's not that kind of elevator, it's old and industrial, and when it arrives at a floor, it just rattles to a stop. There's no chime. I'd ridden it maybe 50 times and never heard it chime. I turned around and walked back to the elevator bank. The service elevator doors were closed. The floor indicator above it showed it sitting at floor 18, the mechanical room level, where it almost always rested when not in use. I pushed the call button, the elevator came down, I rode it up to 18 and checked the mechanical room, found nothing, came back down. I logged it as an anomaly and forgot about it by morning. The second time was 3 nights later, Friday. I was on the 15th floor around 2:30 in the morning, finishing up the upper floor sweep. The 15th floor has a mix of tenants, a small hedge fund, a tech startup that subleases 3 offices, and a legal translation service. The translation service keeps unusual hours and sometimes has staff there until 9 or 10 at night, but by 2:30 even they're long gone. I was checking the translation service's door. It was my habit to give each suite door a slight tug to confirm it was locked when I heard footsteps from the floor above me. Clear footsteps. The kind you hear when someone is walking across a tile or hardwood floor in dress shoes. Deliberate, measured. Not the random settling sounds of a building, not a pipe cooling in the walls. The 16th floor is entirely occupied by a financial advisory group. They are, in my experience, among the most buttoned-up tenants in the building. Nobody from their firm stays late without prior notification to security. It's written into their lease agreement. On that Friday night, no notification had been received. I took the stairwell up to 16 and the floor was dark. Not just dim dark. The emergency lighting seemed to be functioning, but weakly, as if the bulbs were close to the end of their life. I walked the main corridor. The carpet muffled my steps. All the suite doors were locked. At the far end of the corridor, near the window overlooking the street, was a fire exit door. It was closed. I confirmed it was secure. I walked back and checked the other stairwell. Nothing. I stood in the corridor for a minute, listening. Silence. I went back downstairs, logged the observation, noted that the emergency lighting on 16 needed maintenance, and got back to my desk. By the time I sat down, I'd half convinced myself it had been a sound from outside, maybe someone in the parking garage across the street, or a noise carried up the building's ventilation shaft. That was easier to believe than the alternative. The third incident is where things began to change character. It was a Wednesday, about 2 weeks after the elevator chime. I was doing my 3 a.m. sweep of the upper floors. I'd been working my way up from the 17th floor, checking each landing and doing a brief corridor walk on each level. By the time I reached the 21st floor, I was tired and moving on autopilot. The 21st floor is partially leased by a pharmaceutical consulting group. Good tenants. Quiet. They occupy the north half of the floor. The south half is vacant, has been for about a year and a half since an architecture firm relocated to a newer building across town. I was checking the south corridor, the vacant half, when I saw the light. There's a room at the end of that south corridor that the building leases as storage. It's not a proper office suite, it's more of an oversized supply closet, maybe 400 square feet with metal shelving and a fluorescent light panel. Nobody leases it for workspace. The building's property management company uses it to store maintenance supplies and archived paper records from some previous tenant. The light under the door was on. Not the dim amber of emergency lighting, full white fluorescent light. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, I could see it clearly. I knocked. No answer. I tried the door. Locked. I have a master key. I've had one for 4 years, and I can tell you that in 4 years of working that building, I have never once thought twice about using it. I use it 5 or 6 times a shift without thinking. But standing at that door at 3 in the morning with the fluorescent light on inside, I hesitated. I'm not ashamed to say that. I stood there for what was probably 20 seconds before I put the key in. The room was empty, shelving units along both walls, mostly bare except for a few cardboard archive boxes and some cleaning supplies. The fluorescent light was on. It buzzed faintly, the way those old tube fixtures do when they've been on for a long time. The room smelled like dust and old paper. No windows, no other doors. I stood in the threshold for a moment, then turned off the light, locked the door, and went back to my desk. I've since thought a lot about whether there's a mundane explanation for that light. The most obvious would be that someone on the day shift had left it on. It's possible. The maintenance crew is in and out of that storage room a couple of times a week. Maybe a technician had been in there earlier in the evening and forgotten to hit the switch on the way out. I went back and forth on that for a while. What bothered me wasn't the light itself. What bothered me was the sound I heard when I turned around to leave. It was very faint, barely audible over the building's ventilation hum. Someone breathing. Close, right behind me almost. I turned around immediately. Empty room, shelving units, archive boxes, fluorescent tube, now dark. I left quickly. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I want to tell you about a man named Desmond who worked the afternoon shift 2 p.m. to 9 p.m. and had been at the Hargrove building for 7 years before me. Desmond was the kind of person who knew every corner of that building, every quirk, every tenant. He knew which vending machine on which floor would give you an extra snack if you pressed the button twice, and he knew which parking space in the basement had a carbon monoxide sensor that would occasionally trip a false alarm if a diesel truck idled outside. That kind of knowledge. I caught him one evening during the shift handoff. He was finishing up his paperwork, and I was checking in, and I asked him casually whether he'd ever noticed anything unusual on the upper floors, particularly the 21st, particularly the south corridor. He set down his pen. "The storage room?" he said. I told him yes. I kept my description vague. I said I'd noticed the light on and found the room empty when I unlocked it. He nodded slowly, like he was deciding something. "There was a man," Desmond said, "who leased an office on 21, before the architecture firm, before all of that. This would have been maybe 9 or 10 years ago. I wasn't here for it, but I heard about it from a woman named Cecilia who was working reception back then." He paused. He picked up his pen, then set it back down. He worked alone, ran some kind of one-man consulting business. Cecilia said he was always the last one in the building at night, every night without exception. She'd see him come in around 8 in the morning, and the parking attendant would see his car still in the structure when they locked up at 11. The building didn't have round-the-clock security back then. They added that later. "What happened to him?" I asked. Nothing dramatic. He just stopped coming in one day. Left all his things. His filing cabinets, his furniture, even his computer. The building management had to hire a company to clear the office out because nobody ever came back for any of it. They tried to locate him. As far as I know, they couldn't. He paused again. Then he said, Cecilia told me he used to say the building felt different at night. That it felt like there were more floors than there should be. I asked him what that meant. Desmond shrugged. She asked him the same thing. He said that when he stayed late enough, sometimes the elevator would take longer than it should, like it was stopping at a floor that wasn't on the panel. I've ridden those elevators a lot, 4 years, 5 nights a week on average. Multiple trips per shift, I've ridden them hundreds of times. I know their rhythms. Elevator 3 is the slowest. It's always been that way. Some issue with the motor that the building's maintenance company claims is cosmetic and doesn't affect function. Elevator 1 is the fastest and tends to run slightly cold due to its proximity to a ventilation return. I know these elevators, so when I tell you what happened on the last Saturday of that November, I need you to understand that I know the difference between normal and abnormal in that particular elevator bank. I was riding elevator 2 up to the 22nd floor for the last sweep of my shift. It was 4:45 in the morning. The elevator rose normally from the lobby G, 2, 3, on up, and then somewhere between the 21st and 22nd floor it slowed. Not the smooth deceleration of an elevator approaching its destination, a slow grinding reduction in speed like something was pulling back against the motor. Then it stopped. The floor indicator read 22, but the doors didn't open. I waited and I pressed the door open button. Nothing. I pressed the lobby button thinking I'd ride back down and take a different elevator up. The button lit up, but the elevator didn't move. I looked at the floor indicator. It still read 22. But then it changed. The digital display flickered the way those old segmented displays sometimes do when a digit is halfway between states, and for a moment it showed something that I can only describe as a number above 22, not 23. The building has 22 floors. The display should not have been able to show a number above 22, but the indicator flickered through what looked like additional digits before it snapped back to 22. The door slid open, and I was looking at the perfectly normal 22nd floor corridor. I stepped out. The corridor was empty. The overhead lights were on, which they shouldn't have been like the storage room. This floor's lights are on an occupancy sensor, and they'd have gone dark hours ago. At the far end of the corridor, the door to the stairwell was just closing. I watched the latch click into place. I ran. I pushed through that stairwell door within 4 seconds of seeing it close. The stairwell was empty in both directions. I looked up, nothing above. I looked down, nothing below. I stood there for a moment, breathing. From somewhere above me, and there is no above, because 22 is the top floor, and above the 22nd floor stairwell landing is only the access hatch to the roof. I heard a door close. I did not go up to the roof access hatch. I want to be honest about that. I went back to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, sat down at my desk, and spent the remaining 15 minutes of my shift staring at the elevator camera feeds. All 4 elevators were stationary at the lobby level. The service elevator was at 18. The freight elevator was in the basement. Nothing moved until my relief arrived at 5 a.m. I told the story once more about 6 months after the events I've described, to a woman named Phyllis who manages one of the insurance firms on the 12th floor. I ran into her in the parking structure one evening when she was coming back to retrieve something she'd left at her desk. We'd spoken maybe a dozen times over the years, just pleasantries, weather, sports, the kinds of short exchanges you have with someone you see regularly but don't really know. But something about the hour and the dim fluorescent light of the parking structure made me bring it up. I kept it brief. I told her about the lights, the footsteps, the elevator. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "My daughter used to say there was a floor above the last floor." I didn't know what to say to that. "She was 11, Phyllis continued. "We used to come up here on weekends when I had to catch up on work. She'd stay in the office and read or draw. She was never scared of this building. She liked it, actually. Said it felt old in a way that wasn't bad. But she always said that there was a floor above the last floor, that sometimes she could hear someone walking up there." "Did you ever check?" I asked. "Of course. I took her up to 22 and showed her the roof access and explained that there wasn't anything above that." Phyllis picked up her bag from the passenger seat of her car. She thought about it for a while and then she said, "Maybe it's not a floor for us." She said goodnight and walked to the elevator. I still work at the Hargrove building. My shift, my desk, my patrols all the same. I've ridden elevator 2 dozens of times since that November, and it's behaved perfectly normally every time. I've been in the storage room on 21 for maintenance checks, and the light has always been off when I arrive. The 22nd floor has been dark and silent on every sweep I've done since. I did ask one of the building's maintenance technicians, a man named Curtis, who's been servicing the building for over a decade, whether the elevator control system had any known glitches. He asked me why I wanted to know. I made up something about a tenant complaint. He told me the control panels on all 6 elevators had been replaced 2 years prior, the same autumn I'm describing, as part of a scheduled upgrade. He said the old panels had occasionally displayed errors in the floor indicator when the signal board was warm. He said it wasn't dangerous, just cosmetic. He said the new panel shouldn't have that issue. I thanked him and didn't push further. I've thought about what Desmond's colleague said about the building feeling like it had more floors than it should. I think about the man who left all his furniture behind and didn't come back. I think about an 11-year-old girl sitting in an empty office on a Saturday, drawing pictures and listening to footsteps from above. I do my patrols the same way I always have. I log what I observe. On quiet nights, which is most of them, I make my rounds, check the cameras, and sit at my desk until morning. But I'll tell you this, whenever I ride elevator 2 now, I watch the floor indicator the entire trip. And every now and then, not often, maybe once or twice a month, there's a flicker in that display as the elevator rises through the upper floors. Just a brief stuttering in the digits, nothing you'd notice if you weren't looking for it. I've never said anything to building management. I'm not sure what I'd say. I'm not sure what explanation would satisfy me. Some things that happen in the late hours of an empty building don't resolve cleanly, and I've found that the best you can do after 11 years in this line of work is keep your log, stay professional, and understand that not every door you open is going to show you what you expect. And some doors maybe you leave closed. We continue. My name is Kenaro, and for 11 years I read electricity meters for the regional company that serves the dry valley where I was born. I am telling this because I am about to retire, and a man should empty his pockets before he closes the door. My wife says I should keep quiet, that people will laugh, that I will sound like one of those old men who confuse a fever with a ghost. Maybe she's right, but I know what I saw on the Siete route, and I know that the company knows it too, even if their computers say otherwise. I should explain the work first, because everything that happened grew out of the ordinary parts of it. A meter reader is not an important man. You walk, you climb fences, you fight dogs, you write numbers in a book, and at the end of the month somebody pays a bill because of those numbers. In the city it is easy. The houses are close, the meters are at the front, the streets have names. But the rural sectors are different. Out there, the properties are scattered across kilometers of fields. The addresses are descriptions instead of numbers. The house past the broken bridge, the second gate after the eucalyptus, and a reader can walk an entire morning to record 8 or 9 accounts. I took the Siete route because it paid more. My father had been sick for a long time, and the medicine he needed was not the cheap kind. The rural routes carried a hardship bonus, and the man who had walked Siete before me had left without warning, so the supervisor offered it to me on a Friday, and I started the following Monday. His name was Hilario. I never met him. I only knew him through his handwriting because the company in those years still used paper route ledgers, fat books with a line for every account, and Hilario's book was handed to me along with the keys to the company motorcycle. That ledger is where this story really lives. I want you to remember it. The first weeks on Siete were nothing, long, hot, lonely, but nothing. I learned the route the way you learn a face, slowly, then all at once. I learned which dogs were tied and which were not. I learned that the well at the Paredes farm had cold water, and that the widow there would give a cup to anyone who asked. I learned the rhythm of the numbers, the way honest meters climb a little each month and dishonest ones do not climb at all because somebody has thrown a hook over the line to steal current. That kind of theft was the only mystery I expected to find out there, and I found plenty of it, and I reported it, and that was that. Then I came to account 44771. It was near the end of the route, in a fold of the land where the road gave up being a road and became 2 ruts in the grass. The ledger described it as Casa de los Almeida, past the dry canal, Blue Door. When I reached the place on my first pass, in the second week of March, I found a house that no one had lived in for years. The blue door was the only blue thing left. The rest had gone the grey of old wood. The roof had fallen in over half the structure. Thistles grew waist high against the walls. It was plainly a ruin. But the meter was spinning. I want to be precise because precision is the only honest tool a man like me has. The disc inside an old induction meter turns in proportion to the current passing through it. A house with the power on and nothing running might turn the disc once every few minutes, lazily. A house drawing real load, a pump, an iron, a stove turns it steadily. The meter on the Almeida house, screwed to a post by the collapsed porch, was turning fast and smooth, the way it turns when a family is home in the evening with every light burning and a meal on the fire. It was 11 in the morning, the house was a shell, and the disc was spinning as if a dozen people lived inside. My first thought was the only sensible one: theft. Somebody downhill had thrown a clandestine line off this dead account to hide their own consumption, and the load was registering here. It happens. I wrote the reading, noted, verify possible irregular connection, and moved on. A reader does not solve crimes. He records numbers and lets the technical department lose sleep. That night I opened Hilario's ledger to copy my readings into the office system, and I went back, out of curiosity, to see what he had written for 4471 over his own years on the route. The early entries were ordinary: a reading, a date, his initials. But somewhere in the previous year the entries began to change. Beside the numbers he started adding small notes in the margin, the way a tired man talks to himself. Disc fast again. Then, a month later, house still empty, asked in town, family gone long ago. Then, lights on inside at 4 p.m, no one there. His handwriting, which had been a clock's neat hand, grew smaller and more crowded as the months went on, as if he were trying to fit fear into the space the company allowed for numbers. I told myself Hilario had been a nervous man. I told myself a lot of things in those weeks. It is easy to be brave at a kitchen table with the radio on. In April, the consumption on 4471 doubled. The technical department had done nothing they never do. For a few stolen kilowatts in a sector that loses money anyway, so the disc kept turning, and now it turned faster than any honest household I had ever measured. I decided I would go back and look properly. Not at 11 in the morning when the valley light flattens everything and makes even a ruin look harmless, but later, when the work was done and I had no excuse to hurry past. I reached the Almeida house on the last Thursday of April near 6 in the evening. The sun was already low behind the hills, and the long shadows had come out of the canal and the thistles. I parked the motorcycle at the dry canal and walked the rest, the ledger under my arm, because I did not want to leave anything of value on the bike out there. The house looked exactly as it had, grey, broken, swallowed by weeds. But as I came around the fallen porch toward the meter post, I stopped, because there was light in the windows, not strong light, a warm, low yellow light, the color of an oil lamp or a weak bulb, the light a house has when a family is settling in for the night. It came from inside the half of the house that had not collapsed, leaking out through the gaps in the boards. And I could hear, under the wind, a sound that did not belong to a ruin. The small domestic music of people in a kitchen, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon, a woman's voice too soft to make out words, and then a child laughing. I am not a brave man, but I am a stubborn one, and stubbornness will carry you to places bravery would refuse. I told myself even then that there was a logical answer. Squatters. A family without papers had moved into the dry half of the ruin and was stealing power off the very account that fed the meter, which would explain everything: the spinning disc, the light, the voices. That made sense. That was a thing I could write in a book. So I did what a reader does. I walked up to the post to take the reading, and I knocked on the blue door to tell whoever lived there that the connection was irregular and would have to be cut. The voices stopped. Then the door opened and a woman stood in it with the warm light behind her, drying her hands on an apron, smiling at me the way you smile at a neighbor you have been expecting. She was perhaps 50, with grey threaded through her hair and a kind, tired face. Behind her I could see the inside of the house, and this is the part my wife does not believe, and I do not blame her. The inside was whole, not a ruin, a clean, poor, ordinary kitchen, with a table set for supper, a kettle on a small stove, a calendar on the wall, and at the table an old man and 2 children, all of them turning to look at me, all of them with that same waiting smile. "You came," the woman said, not as a question, as a relief. "We set a place for you. Come in, the food is hot." There was in fact a place set at the table, an empty chair, a plate, a cup, waiting. I want to tell you that I understood at once and ran. I did not. The thing about a trap baited with kindness is that the kindness is real. What is false is only the floor beneath it. The woman's voice was warm. The smell of the food reached me, and it was a good smell, onions and corn and something stewed, and I'd walked all day and eaten only bread. The old man lifted a hand and beckoned me. One of the children patted the empty chair. Every part of it said, "You belong here, you are tired, sit down, you are home." And some part of me, the part that was tired and lonely and far from my own table, took a step toward the door. It was the ledger that saved me. I had it under my arm, and as I stepped forward it slipped, and I grabbed at it, and my eyes fell on the cover where Hilario had written the route number, and in that half second I remembered his handwriting getting smaller and smaller, and I remembered the one entry I had read last and not understood. 3 nights before, copying his old notes, I had come to the final line he ever wrote for account 4471, scrawled across the margin in letters that pressed hard into the paper. "Do not sit down. Whatever they say, do not sit down with them." I stopped with my foot on the threshold. "I can't," I said. My voice came out wrong, too high. "I have other accounts. I only came to read the meter." The woman's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "There is no hurry," she said. "Everyone has time for supper. Sit. We have waited so long for someone to sit." "We have waited so long," the old man repeated, and the children repeated it too, all 3 of them at once, in the same flat, hopeful tone, and that was when the warmth finally turned to ice in me, because no living family speaks in one voice. I stepped back. The woman's hand came out of the doorway toward me, not grabbing, only offering palm up, and I saw that the light did not fall on it the way light falls on a hand. It passed through the edges of her fingers like water through a comb. I turned and I walked fast, not running, because some animal part of me knew that running is what you do in front of a thing that chases, and I did not want to teach it to chase. I walked to the canal with my back prickling and the voices behind me calling all together, "Come back, the food is getting cold, come back, sit with us." I reached the motorcycle. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the key twice in the dirt. When the engine finally caught, I looked back once, only once, and the house was a ruin again. Grey wood, fallen roof, no light, no smoke. But standing in the doorless doorway where the blue door hung from one hinge were 4 pale shapes close together, watching me go. And the meter on the post was spinning, fast and smooth, faster than I had ever seen it turn. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my own kitchen table with every light in the house burning. I know how that sounds. A meter reader running up his own bill out of fear of the dark. And I read Hilario's ledger from the first page to the last. And now I read it the way you read a letter from a drowning man. It was all there, once I knew what I was looking at. Years of ordinary readings, and then the slow turn. The disc speeding up. The empty house drawing more and more current. His notes describing the lights, the voices, the family that should not have been there. And in the last months, the thing that frightened me most, because it was the same thing happening to me. Hilario had stopped writing about cutting the power and started writing about the family as if he knew them. The boy waved today. She left bread on the post for me. They only want company. Maybe it is not so terrible to keep them company. And then in a different hand, harder, as if he had caught himself. Do not sit down. Whatever they say, do not sit down with them. And then nothing. The ledger ended. He had walked off the route in the middle of a month and never come back, and no one had ever found him to ask why. In the morning I went to the office and I did something a meter reader almost never does. I asked questions. I found an old man in the records department, a clerk near retirement who had been with the company longer than the computers, and I asked him about the Almeida account on the Siete route. He went pale in a way I did not expect, and he took me to a corner where no one could hear, and he told me what the system would never say. There had been a family named Almeida, he said. Years ago, long before my time, long before Hilario's. A mother, a grandfather, 2 children, in that little house past the dry canal. There had been a sickness in the valley one winter, the kind that comes through a household like a draft under a door, and they had all gone within the same week. The house had been condemned and the account should have been closed, but the account had never closed. Month after month it kept registering consumption, more in some years than others, and every reader who walked the Siete route eventually came to the supervisor with the same story, and every one of them was told the same thing. It is theft. It is a faulty meter. Leave it alone. Just write the number. The company did not want to spend money chasing a few kilowatts in a sector that lost money. So the account stayed open, and the readers kept walking past it. And some of them, the clerk said this very quietly, some of them did not stay long on the Siete route. A few transferred, a few quit. One or two, like Hilario, simply stopped coming and were marked as having abandoned the job and were not looked for, because men who walk away from hard rural routes are not unusual, and the company has no patience for them. "Why does the meter spin?" I asked him. "If there is no one there, what is using the current?" He looked at me for a long time. "Maybe nothing uses it," he said at last. "Maybe the spinning is not a measurement. Maybe it is an invitation. Maybe the house is not drawing power. Maybe it is reaching out." I did not go back to the Almeida house. I read the meter from the canal with a pair of binoculars from then on, recording whatever number I could make out from a distance. And when I could not see it, I wrote down an estimate, which is against the rules, and I do not care. I finished my years on the Siete route that way, and when a younger man was hired, I asked to be moved to the town sectors, and the supervisor, who I think knew more than he ever said, moved me without a single question. But I did one more thing before I left the route, and it is the reason I can sleep now. I took Hilario's ledger to the records office, and I made the old clerk witness it, and together we wrote a formal request to close account 4471, with the history attached, asking the company in plain language to disconnect the line at the source, at the pole transformer, so that nothing on that property could ever draw current again. I thought in my simple way that if the spinning was an invitation, then cutting the wire would be like taking the bait off a hook. The request went up the chain. 3 weeks later I received the official answer, stamped and signed, and I have kept it all these years. It said that account 4471 did not exist, not that it had been closed, not that it had been disconnected, that it did not exist and had never existed in the company's records. There was no Almeida account on the Siete route. There never had been. The line in Hilario's ledger, they said, must have been an error, a duplicated entry, a reader's mistake. And when I went to find Hilario's ledger again to prove them wrong, to put the fat book with his shrinking handwriting on the supervisor's desk, it was gone from the shelf where I had left it, and no one in the office remembered ever having seen it. And the old clerk who had witnessed my request had retired the week before and moved to live with his daughter in another province, and no one had his address. So I have nothing to show you. No ledger, no account, no body, no proof that a family named Almeida ever lived and died past the dry canal on the Siete route. I have only the official letter telling me that the thing I spent 11 years walking past was never there at all, which a careful man might read as the most frightening document of them all, because it means that whatever kept the lights on in that ruin was strong enough to reach out of a broken house and erase itself from the memory of the company that owned the very wire it lived on. I am old now and I no longer read meters, but last month my granddaughter showed me the new tablet the company gives its readers, the little screen that pings every account on a route, and she was complaining, in the way the young complain, about a phantom reading that keeps appearing on her sector and that the office tells her to ignore. An account with no name and no address, she said, out past a dry canal, that pings once a month, always in the evening, always drawing current as if a whole family were home with every light burning and a meal on the fire. I asked her to show me the number. She did. It was 4471. I told her to read it from a distance. I told her never to knock on the blue door. I told her that if anyone ever opened it and offered her a chair, she should thank them very politely, and she should not sit down, and she should walk, not run back to the road, and never look at the windows again. She laughed at me the way the young do. She thinks I am an old man who confused a fever with a ghost. I hope she is right. But I left a place set at her table that night, the way you do for a guest who has not yet arrived, and in the morning the food was gone and the chair was pulled out, and none of us had touched it. There are accounts in this world that no one opened and no one can close. I spent my life reading numbers off a wire, and I never understood until it was almost too late that some of those numbers were not telling me how much a house was using. They were telling me how badly it wanted company. We continue. I'm sharing this because I can't keep it to myself any longer, and I figure that telling it to strangers is the safest way to get it off my chest. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been driving long-haul freight for 16 years across the Pacific Northwest. And in all that time I've seen ice storms that would make your hair turn white. I've blown tires at 60 miles an hour. I've pulled a woman out of a flipped minivan on the side of I-90. None of that unsettled me the way this did. I'm not a superstitious man, and I grew up in a household where my father would have laughed you straight out of the kitchen if you mentioned ghosts. He was a mechanic, practical to the bone, and I inherited that from him. So understand when I tell you what happened on Route 9, I'm not embellishing. I'm not the type. What I'm doing here is laying out the facts the same way I'd describe a transmission problem or a brake failure, clearly in order, with nothing added. It was a Thursday in late October. I remember the month because the leaves were down and the rain was coming in sideways off the Columbia River. I was running a refrigerated load out of Yakima frozen produce for a distribution center outside of Portland. The kind of run I've done maybe 200 times, nothing unusual about it. My dispatcher had given me a slightly irregular route that night because there was construction on the main corridor. And so I found myself on Route 9, a 2-lane highway that cuts through the foothills south of Mount Baker. Mostly dairy farms and old timber land up there. Not much traffic after 9 in the evening. I stopped at a diner called Patty's around 10:30. It was the kind of place that looks like it hasn't changed since 1987. Vinyl booths, a laminated menu, a pie case with 3 pies in it. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie because I was running on 4 hours of sleep and sugar was the only currency that still worked. There was only one other customer in the place, sitting 2 stools down from me. He was a man in his late 60s, heavy-set, wearing a canvas work jacket with a patch on the shoulder from a local volunteer fire department. He was nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the counter like it had done something to offend him. The waitress, a woman named Gail, according to her name tag, brought my pie and refilled my coffee without me asking, which I always appreciate. I made some small comment about the weather, and she shook her head and said it had been a difficult week in town. I asked what she meant. She lowered her voice even though there was almost no one in the diner, and said that a young woman from the area had been killed on Route 9 2 nights ago. A deer had run into the road and she had swerved and gone into a drainage ditch. She was 23 years old. Her name was Clara. She had grown up in the valley and had just come back from 2 years working in Seattle. She had been on her way home to her parents' house when it happened. She drove that road every time she came back, Gail said. And the way she said it, not with drama, but with that flat, tired grief of someone who has known a person their whole life, made it land harder than a newspaper article would have. I ate my pie quietly after that. The man down the counter hadn't moved or spoken, and I got the sense he had heard this story more than once and was carrying his own weight of it. I paid, left a decent tip, and went back to my truck. Route 9 in the rain at 11 at night is a particular kind of dark. The tree line on both sides is dense enough that your headlights feel swallowed up before they can reach anything. I had my wipers on high and the defroster running and the radio on a country station out of Bellingham, though the signal was drifting in and out. I was maybe 12 miles past the diner when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road facing the oncoming direction, my direction with her arm out and her thumb up, hitchhiking. My first instinct, as it always is, was to keep moving. I don't pick up hitchhikers, not because I'm unfriendly, but because the risk calculus doesn't make sense when you're alone in a cab worth 6 figures. But something about the situation made me ease off the accelerator. It was the rain mostly, it was coming down hard and she wasn't wearing a rain jacket. She was in a light blue fleece pullover that was already soaked through and she had a canvas tote bag over one shoulder. She looked cold and she looked real and I pulled over before I had fully decided to. She got in quickly and pulled the door shut. The smell of rain came in with her. She settled the tote bag on her lap and pushed her wet hair back from her face and said thank you in a normal, clear voice. She was young, I'd have said early 20s. Brown hair, dark eyes, unremarkable features except that she looked exhausted in the way that people do when they've been out in weather too long. She told me her name was Clara and that she was trying to get home to her parents' place, a few miles up the road. I can describe to you exactly what I felt in that moment. Nothing unusual. She sat there in the passenger seat and she seemed as solid and present as the dashboard in front of me. I made the kind of small talk you make in those situations, asked if she'd been stuck out there long, asked if her car had broken down. She said she wasn't sure how long she'd been waiting. She said she'd had trouble with the road and had needed help. I asked her which house was her family's, and she gave me a description. A white farmhouse with a red mailbox and a pine tree in the front yard that had been struck by lightning years ago and had this distinctive split trunk. She said her parents would be up. She said her mother always kept a light on. Rough night to be out, I said. Yes, she said. She looked out the window at the passing trees and didn't say anything else for a while, and I noticed at some point that she hadn't removed the canvas tote bag from her lap, but was holding it with both hands pressed flat against it the way people hold something when they're trying to reassure themselves it's still there. Do you know this road well? I asked. I've driven it 100 times, she said. Then after a pause, I was just on it. There was something off about the way she said that. Not threatening, she didn't seem agitated or strange. It was more like she was telling me something she herself was still working out. I chalked it up to whatever had put her on the side of the road in the rain and didn't press it. What I noticed next I can only describe as an atmospheric change, which I know sounds like nothing, but it was real. The cab felt different. Not colder exactly, but heavier, like the air pressure had dropped slightly. I felt that sensation before when a storm front moves in fast, and this had that same quality, a density to the silence, a slight change in the way sound traveled in the enclosed space. The radio, which had been playing something low, cut out entirely. I glanced over at her. She was looking straight ahead at the road. Her profile was lit by the glow of the dashboard instruments. She looked calm. She looked exactly like a real person. I asked her a question. I think I asked whether she had family expecting her, and she turned to answer me. And when I looked back at the road, I had to brake hard because a deer had stepped into my headlights. It froze there for 2 full seconds, wide-eyed, then bolted into the tree line on my left. I gripped the wheel and let out a long breath. That's how it happens, she said quietly. When I looked back at the passenger seat, she wasn't there. I want to be very precise about what I mean by that, because I know how it sounds. She was there when I looked at her. She was not there when I looked away and back. The door had not opened. I know this because the interior door alarm does not make a sound in my truck. It's an old system, nothing digital, but the physical latch mechanism clicks audibly when the door opens, and I did not hear it. The tote bag was gone. The seat was not wet. I drove for about a mile before I pulled over. I sat there with the engine running and the rain hammering the roof of the cab, and I took stock of myself. I was not sleep-deprived beyond reason. I had not been drinking, I had not taken any medication, I had been 30 minutes ago an entirely rational man eating apple pie. I thought about what Gail had told me, the young woman named Clara, the ditch, the deer. I got back on the road. I drove slowly, watching the right-hand shoulder, and after 3 or 4 miles I saw it a white farmhouse set back from the road with a red mailbox at the end of the drive. In the front yard there was a pine tree with a split trunk, exactly as she had described it. There was a light on in a downstairs window, a warm yellow rectangle in all that darkness and rain. I pulled into the driveway. I sat there for a long time trying to decide what I was going to do. There are no good options in that situation. You can knock on the door and say that your daughter got into my truck on the highway and then disappeared, that she told me to bring her home, and so I came. In the end I got out of the truck, I walked up to the front door in the rain and I knocked. A woman answered, mid-50s, silver hair, the kind of face that looked like it had been doing its crying in private. She looked at me through the screen door, with the wary expression of someone who has recently had strangers at her door delivering bad news. I didn't know what to say. I stood there like an idiot for a moment. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said finally. "I was driving on Route 9 tonight and I just wanted to make sure you were all right. I heard there was an accident on this road." The woman looked at me for a long moment. Behind her I could see the lit interior of the house, a couch with an Afghan blanket folded over it, family photographs on the wall, a mug on the end table. "Our daughter," she said, 2 nights ago. She said it the same way Gail had said it, flat and carried. I nodded. "I'm sorry," I said. I don't know why exactly, but I drove past and saw the light and I wanted to stop. I'm sorry for your loss." She didn't seem alarmed by me or suspicious of me. She just looked at me through the screen door with a kind of exhausted gratitude that a stranger had stopped at all. "She used to love this road," the woman said. "She knew every mile of it." "I believe that," I said. I went back to my truck. I sat in the driveway for another few minutes before I backed out and got onto Route 9 again. The rain was easing. The radio found its signal again and played something I didn't recognize. I've done that route twice since then. I don't take Route 9 anymore when I have a choice, not because I'm afraid of seeing her again. I think I've made my peace with the possibility that what happened was real, that it meant something, that she needed to make it home one more time and I happened to be there. What I'm less at peace with is the deer in my headlights and the sound of her voice. That's how it happens, like she was describing it from the outside, like she had already watched it from somewhere I couldn't see. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. My father, the mechanic, would have had a practical explanation for all of it. Fatigue, suggestion, pattern recognition in the dark. He wouldn't have been wrong to try. But I drove to that farmhouse and knocked on that door, and the woman who answered fit exactly the description of the mother of a girl named Clara, who died 2 nights before on a road she had known her whole life. I don't have a clean ending to give you. The load made it to Portland. I signed the delivery paperwork at 2:47 in the morning and drove back to Yakima in the grey light before dawn. I didn't tell my dispatcher or my wife or anyone else what had happened until now. I've been driving these roads for 16 years. I know how to read ice and fog and black asphalt at 90 feet per second. What I don't know how to read is what it means that the seat wasn't wet, that the door never opened, that she knew exactly which house had the light on. She made it home. I'm choosing to believe that means something. We continue. There's something about places that hold secrets, and not the kind of secrets people keep. Those are almost always smaller than you imagine once they come out. I mean the kind that a place absorbs over time, like a sponge sitting in the same dark corner for decades. Roads, old warehouses, churches, water towers. I should know. I've spent the last 11 years driving a refrigerated transport rig across 3 states, and I've passed through more forgotten corners of this country than most people will ever see in a lifetime. I've watched towns that used to have names slowly become just an exit number on the highway. I've seen gas stations that closed so long ago the pumps are rusted shut, but the lights somehow still flicker at 3 in the morning. Most of the time, I tell myself there's a rational explanation for everything. Faulty wiring, old infrastructure on failing timers, my eyes playing tricks after 14 hours behind the wheel. Most of the time, I believe it. My name is Clarence Whitfield. I'm 44 years old. I live outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, with a dog named Pocket, and a mortgage I should have paid off 3 years ago but didn't because I made some decisions in my 30s that I'm not particularly proud of. I want to be upfront about that part because what happened to me about 8 months ago connects directly to something I did back then. And if I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to tell it the right way. When I was 31, I was in a bad place. Not bad in the sense of desperate or dangerous, bad in the sense of numb. My marriage had ended the year before. Not dramatically, not with fighting or betrayal. It just ended the way a fire does when there's no more oxygen in the room. Slowly, quietly, and by the time you notice, there's nothing left but smoke and the smell of something that used to be warm. My ex-wife Denise moved back to her mother's house in Georgia. We didn't have children. There wasn't much to divide. We divided it anyway, mostly in silence, and then she was gone. I threw myself into work, which in my case meant longer routes, more overnight runs, more hours alone on dark roads with the radio on just loud enough to remind me I was still alive. And somewhere in those months, I started cutting corners. Nothing dramatic at first, a falsified logbook entry here and there claiming I'd rested when I hadn't. Ignoring the weight limit signs on certain county roads because the GPS route added 40 minutes to go around. Then something bigger, I started accepting cash on the side from a logistics coordinator named Frank who worked out of a depot in eastern Kentucky. He would ask me to carry extra pallets, unmanifested, alongside my official cargo. He'd pay me an extra $200 per trip, cash, in an envelope left in my cab door handle before departure. I never asked what was in those pallets. That was part of the arrangement. I did it 6 times. 6 trips at $1,200 in cash that I spent on things I cannot even remember now. And then on the 7th trip, one of those extra pallets was flagged at a weigh station in Western Virginia. The inspectors found it wasn't produce like the rest of my load. It was counterfeit medication, cheap, unregulated manufacturing, the kind of thing that ends up in rural communities where people can't afford real prescriptions and don't ask too many questions. I didn't go to prison. Frank did. I cooperated with investigators, gave up every detail I could, and was handed a significant fine, a suspended license for 8 months, and a permanent note on my commercial record. Frank told the investigators I hadn't known what I was carrying. I don't know if he believed that or if he just wanted to seem like a reasonable man in front of a judge. Either way, that grace, if you can call it that, was not something I deserved. When I got my license back, I was a different kind of careful. Not just about regulations, though. I follow every single one of them now down to the decimal. Careful in a deeper way. The kind of careful that comes from knowing you got away with something you shouldn't have gotten away with. I've been carrying that weight for 13 years, and most days I've learned to carry it without visibly limping. Now let me tell you about last November. I had a 3-day route through Central Appalachian Territory, Eastern Kentucky, down through Southwestern Virginia, with a stop in a small town called Harlan Crossing that most of my colleagues had never heard of, and most GPS systems struggled to locate accurately. It was a pharmaceutical delivery, which is its own kind of irony that doesn't escape me. Legitimate this time, of course. Temperature controlled, manifested to the last unit, everything documented correctly. I've never let myself forget what happens when documentation gets sloppy. The first 2 days went without incident, long stretches of mountain road, mostly empty. I've always liked the Appalachian routes in fall because the tree lines are extraordinary. These walls of red and gold on both sides of the highway that look almost architectural, like someone designed them. I made my first delivery ahead of schedule, spent the night at a truck stop outside of Pikeville, slept well, and headed south the next morning feeling about as settled as I usually feel. The second delivery was a small hospital annex outside a town called Clover Fork. Easy enough loading dock on the north side of the building, a receiving manager named Patrice who was efficient and pleasant and had the documentation signed before I'd finished unloading. I was back in my cab by 2 in the afternoon. My third and final delivery was the problem. It was a medical supply warehouse about 90 miles south, and the routing took me through a stretch of road that I later learned the locals refer to without apparent irony as the Hollow Road. It runs through a narrow valley where 2 ridge lines press close together on either side, and for about a 12-mile stretch there's almost no cell reception, and the tree cover is dense enough that even in early afternoon you're driving in a kind of permanent dusk. The delivery itself was scheduled for the following morning. I had time to burn and no good reason to push through the full 90 miles at once, so somewhere around 5 in the evening, when the light was starting to go amber through the trees, I pulled off at a widened shoulder near an old water tower that sat maybe 100 yards off the road on a small rise. It was the kind of water tower you see in old photographs of American small towns, cylindrical, painted over so many times the original color was unknowable, with a ring of rust around the base and a ladder running up one side that had lost several rungs to time. There was no town near it. There was no obvious reason for it to still be standing, some forgotten infrastructure left behind when the community that had needed it simply ceased to exist. I parked, made a sandwich, put on a radio program through my phone's downloaded content since there was no signal, watched the light change through the windshield. That's one of the parts of this job I genuinely loved, the stillness of a parked rig at the end of a working day, that specific quality of peace that feels like it was earned. I was about 40 minutes into this when I noticed the sound. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss, a low hum, almost subsonic, the kind of thing you feel in your chest before you properly hear it with your ears. I assumed it was my refrigeration unit cycling, which it does periodically to maintain temperature, but when I cut the engine to listen more carefully, it continued, and it was coming from the direction of the water tower. I sat with it for a while. The rational explanations assembled themselves in my head in the way they always do, wind through structural gaps, some kind of drainage or pressure equalization, animals nesting in the base, all plausible, all possible. I almost convinced myself to ignore it, but the sound changed. That's the part that's hard to explain without sounding unhinged. It shifted from a hum into something with more texture. Not quite a voice, not quite music. Something in between rhythmic and low, with a quality that made me think of a person speaking in a language I'd never encountered. The cadence human, but the content nothing I could pass. I got out of the cab. I want to be clear that this was not a brave decision or a curious one. It felt more like inevitability. Like when you've been trying not to think about something for 13 years and one evening your body simply decides the avoidance is finished. The ground between the road shoulder and the base of the rise was overgrown knee-high grass gone dry in November, brittle underfoot. I had my work flashlight, a heavy mag light I've kept in the cab for a decade. The beam was steady, my hands were not, but only slightly. As I got closer to the water tower, the sound became more distinct and simultaneously harder to categorize. And I noticed something that stopped me about 30 feet from the base of the structure. There were items arranged around the base of the tower, not carelessly scattered, arranged, bottles of medicine. Some of the bottles were old enough that the labels had partially dissolved, but I could make out enough to recognize what they were. Beta blockers, insulin, blood pressure medication, heart medication, things people need in order to stay alive. There were dozens of bottles, maybe more. I knew what I was looking at, and I knew why I was standing in front of it. I have tried since then to construct an alternative interpretation, and I cannot build one that holds any weight. The medication in those bottles was the same class of pharmaceutical I had helped distribute the counterfeit version 13 years ago. I don't know if any of it had come from those pallets in my truck. I don't know the specific geography of Frank's distribution network or how far the product traveled, but I know what those bottles meant standing there in a circle at the base of that tower on that road in that county. The sound stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, which was, by this point, genuinely cold, November in eastern Kentucky, but was its own separate sensation, localized and specific, like a hand placed flat against the center of my back. I turned around. There was no one there, but there was something on the ground between me and my truck, sitting in the beam of my flashlight as though it had been placed there deliberately. A logbook. One of the old paper kind, the kind we used before the electronic logging mandate. I walked to it and picked it up. The cover was warped and soft with moisture damage, but I could open it. The entries inside were short and systematic dates, route numbers, mileage, delivery notes, someone else's records from a long time ago. But the last entry, on the final page with writing on it, was different from the others. It wasn't a log entry, it was a name, just a name, written in handwriting that was shakier than the careful notation of all the previous entries, as though whoever had written it was doing so under duress, or in the dark, or at the end of something. The name was not mine. It was a woman's name, first and last, that I did not recognize. Underneath the name, in the same shaky handwriting, 3 words. She needed it. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that the cold I'd felt on my back faded and the ordinary cold of the night reasserted itself. Long enough that I heard a car pass on the road behind me and remembered that the world still contained other people and forward motion and distances still to be covered. I took the logbook back to my truck. I have it still in the storage compartment under my bunk. I have not been able to make myself throw it away, and I have also not been able to make myself look at it again. Both of those things feel like they mean something. I made my final delivery the next morning on schedule without incident. The receiving manager at the warehouse was a quiet man named Dennis who signed everything and offered me a cup of coffee and made small talk about the weather. I accepted the coffee. I said yes, it was supposed to warm up by the weekend. I drove home. I told my brother what had happened about a week later on the phone. He listened without interrupting, which he doesn't normally do. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Clarence, you know you didn't make anyone sick, right? You didn't know what was in those pallets." And I said, "I know. Because I did know that. And also I know that not knowing is a very specific kind of choice and that the woman whose name is written on that last page in that shaky handwriting made no choice at all. She just needed medication and received something that was made to look like medication, and those are not the same thing. I still drive the same routes. I still take the Appalachian assignments because the fall colors are still extraordinary and the stillness of a parked rig at dusk is still one of the best feelings I know. I haven't gone back to the Hollow Road and I'm not sure I will. But here is what I want to say to anyone listening who is in the middle of a small compromise, a quiet arrangement, an envelope in a door handle that asks you not to ask questions. There is almost never a moment of obvious consequence. No one calls you to account. No inspector flags your load. You carry the thing from one place to another place and it disappears into the system and you spend the money and you move on. Most of the time that is all that happens, but the places remember. The roads and the towers and the hollow valleys between the ridgelines. The ground holds things the way water holds cold, longer than seems reasonable, longer than seems fair. And every so often on a late November afternoon when the light is going amber and you have stopped for no particular reason next to something old and forgotten, the account comes due. Not with punishment. That would almost be easier. Just with knowledge. Just with a name in shaky handwriting on the last page of a logbook sitting in a flashlight beam in the dark. I'm Clarence Whitfield. I've been driving 11 years clean, and some nights when Pocket is asleep against my leg and the house is quiet, I can still hear that sound from the water tower, not quite a voice, not quite music, and I think it's probably going to keep finding me for a long time yet. That feels about right. We continue. People who have never done a solitary job tend to imagine that being alone is the same thing as being at peace. They picture quiet, room to think, nobody breathing down your neck. They are wrong, and I can tell you that with the certainty of a man who has spent half his life sealed inside a steel cab in the dark. Solitude is not silence. Solitude is the moment you realize that if something is wrong, there is no one to turn to and ask, "Did you hear that too?" You are the only witness. And a single witness, as I have learned, is very easy to make disappear. I am not telling you this to sound dramatic, and I am telling you so that you understand why a man who has driven a locomotive for 19 years still keeps his window cracked open at night, even in the cold, just to be sure the sounds outside are coming from outside. My name is Aurelio Sandoval. I am 41 years old, and I drive freight on one of the highest railways in the world. The old central line that climbs out of the Peruvian coast and twists up into the Andes, past 4,000 meters, hauling mineral concentrate down from the highlands to the port. If you have never seen this line, picture a thread of iron stitched into the side of a mountain, doubling back on itself in switchbacks because the slope is too steep to climb straight, crossing bridges flung between one tunnel mouth and the next, where the only thing under the wheels is air and a river you cannot see at the bottom. There is a place on that line they call El Infiernillo, the little hell. A bridge no longer than a city block hung between two tunnels, with the gorge below it so deep that when you stop on it your headlamp finds nothing, just black, as if the world simply ended there. I tell you about the geography because the geography is the whole story. A road you can pull off, a road you can turn around on. A train can only go forward or back along one line, and at night on that mountain going back is not always an option. You are committed. Whatever is ahead of you, you are going to meet it. When I was learning the line, my instructor was an old engineer named Matias Quispe, a man who had run that route since before I was born and who treated the locomotive the way a priest treats an altar. He taught me the brakes, the grades, the way the air thins so much up top that the diesel itself seems to struggle for breath. But the lesson he repeated more than any technical instruction had nothing to do with machinery. In the long tunnel, he told me the first week, the one before the high pass, you may hear a whistle. Not the locomotives, higher, like a man whistling a tune through his teeth. If you hear it, you keep your eyes on the rail and you do not answer. You do not whistle back. You do not call out to ask who is there. You let it pass. I asked him what happened if you answered. He did not laugh it off, the way you would expect an old man to laugh off a superstition. He just looked at the tunnel ahead of us for a long moment and then he said, "Honorato answered." And he never explained who Honorato was, and I was new and a little afraid of him, so I did not ask again. That was 19 years ago. I want to be honest with you, the way I have promised myself I would be honest if I ever told this. For 19 years I treated that warning as exactly what I assumed it was, an old man's ritual and the kind of thing that men who work dangerous jobs invent so they have something to hold on to when the dark gets too big. I am not a superstitious person. I left the church when I was young. I read about the things that frighten people and I can usually explain them. I had passed through that tunnel more times than I could count, and I had never heard a whistle, and I had stopped thinking about Matias Quispe's words long before he retired, and long before I heard, a few years later, that he had died quietly in a town near Jauja without ever saying anything more about it. So, now you have the context. Now I can tell you about the night of the 17th. It was a freight run I had done dozens of times, hauling zinc concentrate down from the highlands. We left the loading point in the late afternoon behind schedule because of a problem with the brake line on one of the rear cars that had taken 3 hours to sort out. That delay matters because it meant that instead of clearing the high section in the last of the daylight, the way I preferred, we hit it in full dark, with a cold front rolling in, and the kind of fog that does not drift so much as settle, like something lying down on the rails. I was not alone, which is the only reason I am not still wondering whether I had simply lost my mind. With me in the cab was a brakeman named Wilmer, a kid of maybe 26, quiet, reliable, the sort who actually watches the line instead of his phone. There is no signal up there anyway. I mention him because he is my corroborating witness and the proof that what I am about to describe was not just one tired man's imagination at altitude. We were maybe 40 kilometers from the long tunnel when the first thing happened, and I almost did not register it as a thing at all. It was a level crossing, and an old one near a hamlet that has been all but abandoned since the mine there closed. There are no lights at that crossing, no gates, nothing, because almost nobody lives there to be protected from the train. As we approached, I saw, in the wash of the headlamp, a figure standing beside the rails. A man, I thought, in a long dark coat, holding something at his side that swung a little. A lantern, maybe, though it was not lit. This is normal, I want to be clear. People do stand near the line. Herders, drunks, men walking between villages because there is no other road. So I did what you do. I gave the horn a short blast to warn him, and I watched to make sure he stepped back. And as we rushed past the spot where he had been standing, I looked, and there was no one. "Did you see that guy?" I asked Wilmer. "What guy?" he said. He had been looking at the brake pressure gauge. So I told myself it was a fence post, a shadow, a trick of the fog and the headlamp. The mind builds a man out of a post all the time. I have done it before. I let it go. But the swinging thing in his hand stayed in my memory, the way it had moved, slow, deliberate, like a metronome, like something keeping time. We climbed. The grade got steep and the engine labored and the fog got worse until the headlamp was just a cone of white wall in front of us, and I was running more by feel and by the count of kilometers than by sight. The cab gets very loud in those conditions, all engine and the screech of the wheels on the curves, and yet I started to notice something underneath the noise, a thinness in it. I cannot describe it better than that. It was as if the engine were not quite filling the space the way it should, as if there were a hole in the sound where a sound should be, and the hole was waiting to be filled. Wilma noticed too. He kept glancing back over his shoulder into the dark little corridor behind the seats where there is nothing but the rear wall of the cab. I asked him what he was looking at. He said, "I keep thinking somebody's back there." I told him there was no one back there. He nodded and kept his eyes forward after that, very deliberately forward, and I saw his jaw working the way a man's does when he is trying not to be afraid. We reached the mouth of the long tunnel a little before 2 in the morning. I have gone into that tunnel hundreds of times. It is the highest point on the run. A black throat bored straight through the spine of the mountain, and it takes several minutes to pass through at the speed you can safely run it. Going in, you always feel the change, the air pressure, the sudden enclosure, the way the engine noise comes slamming back at you off the rock. I had felt that change so many times that my body did it without me. But that night, going in, I felt my whole chest tighten, and I did not understand why until I realized that the engine had gone quiet, not stopped. The locomotive was still pulling, the wheels were still turning, I could feel the motion, but the sound of it had dropped away to almost nothing, the way your ears go when you swallow on a descending plane. And in that strange, muffled hush, into the hole that had been waiting in the noise all night came the whistle. It was exactly as the old man had described it 19 years before. A man's whistle, high and tuneful, somewhere up near the roof of the cab, a little melody with no real shape to it, the kind a person makes without thinking while they work. It was inside the tunnel with us. It was inside the cab with us, and it was patient. It would go for a few notes and stop and wait and start again, and as if it were leaving a space each time. A space for an answer. I want to tell you that I was calm. I was not. Every hair on my body stood up at once, and a cold went through me that had nothing to do with the altitude. But the thing that saved me, I think, was that I did not have to decide what to do because I had been told what to do 19 years ago by a man who clearly knew. You do not answer. I clamped my mouth shut. I fixed my eyes on the 2 rails sliding into the dark ahead of the lamp, and I drove. Wilmer did not have a Matthias Kispe. He turned to me, his face grey in the instrument light, and then he whispered, "Aurelio, somebody's whistling." And then, because he is a polite young man and it is instinct, because someone whistling at you in the dark feels like someone calling you, he started to turn toward the back of the cab, and he opened his mouth, and I knew he was about to call out, "Kiananda ahi? Who's there?" I grabbed his arm so hard he flinched. I shook my head. I did not dare speak myself because speaking is answering, so I just shook my head, no. And I held his arm and I felt him shaking, and the whistle went on, those few notes, the pause, the waiting space, the few notes again, and the tunnel went on, and the cone of the headlamp showed only black rock streaming past, and I thought, this tunnel has never been this long. That is when I noticed the reflection. The windscreen of a locomotive at night with the cab lights on becomes a mirror. You see your own face floating out over the tracks, faint, doubled. I have driven for 19 years and I am used to seeing two ghosts in that glass, me and Wilmer, hanging in the dark above the rails. That night there were three. There was a third face in the glass between us and a little behind, low, as if someone were crouching on the floor of the cab in the gap behind our seats. I could not make out features. I could see the pale oval of it, and that it was tilted, the head cocked to one side the way you tilt your head when you are listening very carefully for someone to say something back to you. And I could see that its mouth was pursed. It was the one whistling. I did not turn around. Understand me, every part of my body wanted to turn around, but I knew with an animal certainty that I must not. That turning around to look was a kind of answering to, that the whole game was to get one of us to acknowledge it, to point our attention at it, to invite it in. So I stared at the rails and I drove and I prayed. For the first time in many years I prayed, not in words, just a steady, wordless pleading to whatever might be listening. That was not the thing crouched behind my seat. Wilmer was crying. Silently, his hand over his own mouth now, holding it shut, because he had understood. The whistle came again, closer, and this time between the notes, in the waiting space, I heard it speak. One word, soft, almost kind. It said my name. Aurelio. It knew my name. I do not know how. Maybe it had heard Wilmer say it a minute before. Maybe it had always known it. It said my name the way you call to a child you can see hiding, when you both know the game is nearly over. Aurelio. And it waited. The most enormous patience I have ever felt in my life was contained in that pause. I held the brake handle and I watched the rail and I did not answer. And then ahead, the headlamp found the end of the tunnel, the faint grey smudge of the open night, and the engine noise came rushing back all at once, loud and ordinary and blessed, and we shot out of the throat of the mountain onto the bridge they call El Infiernillo, the little hell. The span hung over the gorge between the two tunnels with nothing below it but black air. And in the instant we crossed it, in the half-second the cab was out over that drop, I felt the third presence leave. I cannot explain how I knew. The cab was simply lighter. The waiting was over. The space in the sound closed up. I looked at the windscreen. Two faces, mine and Wilmer's. We did not speak for a long time. We ran down through the next tunnel and the next, dropping toward the lower stations, losing altitude, the air thickening, and somewhere in there Wilmer put his head between his knees and breathed like a man who has nearly drowned. When he finally sat up, he asked me in a very small voice the question I have carried ever since. What would have happened if I'd answered? I told him the truth. I said I did not know. And then I told him about Matias Quispe and the rule and the name Honorato and how the old man had said it and gone quiet 19 years ago and never explained. I expected Wilmer to be comforted that there was a rule, that someone had survived this before me to pass it down. Instead, he went very still, and he said something that I have not been able to put down since. My grandfather worked this line, he said. He used to tell us about a maquinista who went into the long tunnel one night and came out wrong. He didn't crash, he didn't get hurt, the train was fine. But he wasn't the same man, he stopped sleeping, he stopped talking almost. And after a few weeks he walked out one night and they never found him. He looked at me. My grandfather said the man kept whistling, all day under his breath, the same little tune, like he couldn't stop. Like something had taught him a song and he had to keep singing it. He swallowed. His name was Honorato. I did not say anything, there was nothing to say. We drove the rest of the way down to the coast in silence, and the lights of the city came up out of the dark, and the run ended like any other run, with paperwork and tired men and the smell of coffee, as if nothing at all had happened up there in the mountain. I have gone back through that tunnel many times since. I have to. It is my job, and I am too old and too tied to this work to start over at anything else. Most nights nothing happens. The engine roars the way it should. The windscreen holds only two ghosts. The tunnel ends when it is supposed to end. I have almost convinced myself, on the good nights, that the whole thing was the altitude and the fog and a frightened young man and an old story planting suggestions in my head. But every now and then, going into the long dark before the high pass, I feel the engine noise go thin. I feel the hole open in the sound, the waiting space, and I put my eyes on the rail and I keep my mouth shut, and I do not turn around and I do not answer. No matter what I hear, no matter whose voice it borrows, no matter how kindly it says my name, I want to tell you that I am sure it is nothing. I want to tell you that there is a clean explanation, pressure on the eardrums, oxygen starvation, the brain manufacturing a face out of a smear of light on glass. Maybe there is. I am not a man who likes to believe in things he cannot weigh and measure. But Wilmer does not work the line anymore. He left within the month, took a job in a warehouse on the coast where the ceiling is low and the lights stay on and there are always other people in the room. We talk sometimes. He is fine, mostly. Except that his wife told me the last time I saw them that he has started doing something in his sleep that he never used to do. Something she finds hard to describe. That makes the back of her neck prickle in a way she cannot explain. He whistles, the same few notes over and over with a little pause between them, a waiting space, as if he were leaving room in his sleep for someone to answer back. And I have never told him this and I never will, but I recognize the tune. We continue. My name is Calvin. I'm 26 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've worked the overnight shift doing maintenance at a mid-size hospital on the outskirts of the city. Not the glamorous kind of hospital work people imagine when they hear the word. No scrubs, no saving lives, no dramatic moments under surgical lights. My job is simple and invisible. Mop floors, replace burned-out bulbs, fix leaky pipes in the walls, respond to whatever breaks between midnight and 7 in the morning when nobody's watching. People always ask me how I manage it. Working nights in a hospital, doesn't it bother you? Don't you get scared? I usually laugh it off. You get used to it fast. After a few weeks, the smell of antiseptic doesn't bother you. The sound of monitors flatlining in the distance becomes background noise, and you start recognizing which floor creaks under your weight and which hallway echoes. Truthfully, the night shift suits me. The building empties out. The fluorescent lights hum in a lower register. The daytime staff goes home with their noise and their politics and their opinions about how mops should be stored, and what you're left with is just the work. Quiet, honest, solitary work. I can think. I listen to podcasts. Sometimes I talk to the overnight nurses on the 3rd floor, who are some of the most grounded human beings I've ever met, people who've seen enough to stop pretending the world is something it isn't. But there are parts of the hospital I never liked, even after getting comfortable everywhere else. And I mean parts specifically, not just a general unease about the building. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I grew up in a house where the furnace rattled like something living, where the backyard flooded every spring and grew these tall weeds that looked like hands at night. You either get hardened to that stuff or you don't, and I did. The part of the hospital I didn't like was the basement level, sub-level 2 technically. The newer staff called it the sub-basement. The old-timers just called it the bottom floor and left it at that. It existed mostly as storage archive boxes going back decades, old equipment that hadn't been decommissioned properly, broken IV poles stacked in rows like a crowd of thin people standing very still. There was also a maintenance corridor down there that ran the full length of the building, and once a week I was supposed to walk its length and check the boiler readings, the pressure gauges, the water heater temperature. I hated that corridor. Not because it was dark, I had my flashlight and the overhead tubes usually worked, but because of the smell. Something down there smelled like standing water and something else I could never name. Sweet and wrong. Like fruit that's gone past rotten into something else entirely. I mentioned it once to my supervisor, Dale, a heavy-set guy with 15 years on the job who never seemed rattled by anything. He looked at me for a moment. "It's the drains," he said. "They back up sometimes. Put in a work order." I put in the work order. Nobody came. The smell stayed. I learned to breathe through my mouth during those weekly checks and get them done in under 10 minutes. But the smell isn't what this is about. That's just the background, the foundation. What happened down there happened on a Tuesday night in November, during my 3rd year at the hospital, and it started with a resident named Mr. Aldrich Bowen. Mr. Bowen was in room 214, 2nd floor. He'd been there for almost 6 weeks by then, recovering from a hip replacement that had gone sideways. Some kind of post-surgical complication I never got the full story on. He was in his mid-80s, small man, enormous hands, the kind of face that looked like it had done a lot of weather over the years. His wife had died sometime before he was admitted, and as far as anyone on staff knew, he had no family who visited. His room was always quiet, no flowers, no cards on the windowsill. I noticed him because of the lights. On 4 separate nights across a 3-week stretch, I got called to room 214 because the overhead light wouldn't stop flickering. I'd go in, check the fixture, check the bulb, swap it out, and within 2 days it would start again. The 4th time it happened, Mr. Bowen was awake when I came in. It was around 2 in the morning, and instead of being annoyed at the intrusion, he looked almost relieved to see me. "Calvin," he said. He remembered my name from my ID badge, though I'd never told him. "Sit for a moment, if you don't mind." I had work to do. but there was something in the way he said it, not a request exactly. More like someone who'd been waiting a long time for something and had run out of the ability to be subtle about it. I sat. He didn't say anything for a while. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but the dark parking structure across the street. Then he said, "How long have you been working nights here?" 3 years. "And you've never left because of the basement?" It wasn't a question. I didn't respond right away. "The basement's part of the job," I said finally. He turned and looked at me then. Really looked in a way that older people sometimes do, like they've stopped caring about the performance of conversation and just want to see who they're actually talking to. "Most people who work here don't last 3 years," he said. "The overnight staff, I mean. You're the 4th maintenance person I've seen in this room in 6 weeks. The others quit. 2 of them were young men about your age." I told him people quit night shift jobs all the time. Burnout, schedule conflict, better offers. "Yes," he said, "that's usually the story, isn't it?" He asked me then whether I'd ever noticed anything unusual on the sub-level. His phrasing was careful, not seen anything, noticed anything. I told him about the smell. He nodded slowly like that confirmed something. And the sounds? I started to say I hadn't heard sounds, and then I stopped. Because I had actually, not often, and always easy to explain away the boiler cycling, the pipes settling in the cold. But there had been a few nights when I'd been in that corridor and heard something that didn't belong to the ordinary inventory of building sounds. A kind of slow, dragging noise. Once something that almost sounded like a voice, low and continuous, like someone reciting something in another room. I'd filed it away and not thought about it since. The brain is good at that. Mr. Bowen listened to me describe these things and didn't look surprised. "There is something on that level," he said. "It's been here for longer than this building has been standing." I know that sounds like the kind of thing a sick old man says in the middle of the night. He paused. "I've been aware of it for a long time, before I came here. It follows certain people." "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at his hands. "Because in a few days, I'm going to be transferred to another facility. My condition has stabilized enough, apparently, and when I leave, I won't be able to—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider his phrasing. "There are certain things I've been doing from this room that keep it contained to the lower level, passive things. You wouldn't notice them if you weren't looking. Once I'm gone, I don't know what happens. It may stay quiet, or it may not." I sat there for a moment. I was tired. I had 6 more hours of shift. I said the most honest thing I could think of. "Mr. Bowen, I'm not sure what you're telling me." "I'm telling you to be careful on the lower level after I leave. I'm telling you not to go down there alone. I'm telling you that if you hear the dragging sound and it's moving toward you rather than away, you should leave the building immediately and not go back until daylight." I thanked him for the advice. I meant it sincerely, in the same way you thank someone when you're not sure if they're confused or dangerous or simply speaking a kind of truth that doesn't fit the shape of normal conversation. I changed the bulb. I said goodnight. Mr. Bowen was transferred 4 days later. I know because his room was dark and empty when I passed it on Friday night, and the charge nurse, a woman named Doris who'd worked that floor for 9 years, mentioned it in passing when I stopped to say hello. "Nice old man," she said. "Quiet. He asked about you actually before he left. Asked me to tell you to remember what he said." I remembered. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. The sub-level was the sub-level, cold, bad-smelling, full of shadows and old equipment and the usual low-grade unease. I did my checks. I kept them under 10 minutes. I breathed through my mouth. Then, on a Wednesday in December, one of the boiler readings came back wrong on the automated system, and I had to go down and check manually. It was just past 3 in the morning. I took the service elevator, which opened directly into the maintenance corridor. The smell hit me immediately. Stronger than usual, strong enough that even breathing through my mouth I could taste it, something sweet and rotten and close, like it was concentrated, like the source was nearby rather than diffused through the space. I stood at the elevator entrance for a moment. The corridor stretched ahead of me, about 40 yards of it, lit by those old overhead tubes that buzzed and occasionally dimmed. I had my flashlight, I had my phone. I told myself I'd be in and out in 5 minutes. I walked toward the boiler station, which was about 20 yards in. The readings looked fine in person. The sensor had probably malfunctioned, but I documented them carefully anyway, because that's the job, and because focusing on the job kept my hands from doing anything embarrassing. That's when I heard it, dragging, slow and deliberate, coming from the far end of the corridor, past the boiler station, where the hallway turned and went into the deep storage section, an area I almost never needed to enter. I stopped. My first thought was a rational one. Homeless person. It happened occasionally. Someone had found a way in from the loading dock and was sheltering in the storage area. That was a thing that happened. I dealt with it once before, 2 years ago. I listened. The dragging continued to slow, measured, rhythmic. Too slow for a person walking, too consistent for anything accidental. Then it stopped. The smell got worse. It arrived in a wave, thick, physical, and I actually gagged. My eyes were watering. In the silence after the dragging stopped, I heard something else. That voice. Low, continuous, just below the threshold of words. Coming from the bend in the corridor. I did not walk toward it. I want to be honest about this. I want to say I stood my ground, that curiosity or professionalism or some instinct for the rational overrode everything else. I didn't. I felt something through the air of that corridor, a pressure, or something like pressure. That's the only word I have for it, and everything in me became very focused on the elevator behind me. I walked back, then I ran. I hit the elevator button and stood with my back to the corridor walls while it descended from the ground floor, which took maybe 15 seconds and felt like much longer, and I did not look toward the bend. The doors opened, I got in, I rode up. I spent the rest of the shift on the upper floors. I wrote in the maintenance log that the boiler readings were nominal and the sensor needed recalibration, which was true, and I did not write anything else. I called in sick the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I went back. I told myself I had to. You don't last in this job by letting fear win. You last by going back in. But I went to the 2nd floor first, to room 214. It was still empty. Doris was at the nursing station, and I asked her as casually as I could manage whether she knew which facility Mr. Bowen had been transferred to. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite surprise. "Honey," she said slowly, "Mr. Bowen passed away the day after his transfer. They called to let us know." She paused. "Did you know him?" I said I'd spoken to him a few times. Routine stuff. She nodded. "He was a strange one. Lovely but strange. He left something for you, actually. He gave it to me the morning he was discharged. Said if Calvin asks about me, give him this." She handed me a small envelope, the kind that comes with a greeting card. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small cloth pouch tied shut with a cord, the kind you might find at a craft market or an herbalist shop. The pouch smelled faintly of something dry and sharp, cedar maybe, or something older. The paper had 6 sentences written in careful old-fashioned handwriting. "What is below has always been below. It does not leave. It only waits for what prevents it to no longer be present. The bag is salt and ash from a specific place. Pour it at the entrance to the lower corridor. Do not go past where you poured it until morning." I stood there under the fluorescent lights of the 2nd floor nursing station, holding a cloth pouch from a dead man, and I made a decision that I still think about. I went down. I took the service elevator. When the doors opened into the maintenance corridor, the smell was immediate. That same sweet decay, concentrated and close. But I stood in the doorway of the elevator and I opened the pouch and I poured its contents across the threshold of the corridor. A thin line of gray-white powder, salt and ash from wall to wall. The smell dropped, not disappeared, reduced, like a sound turned down. Nothing came from the far end of the corridor. Nothing dragged. I stood there for a long time. Then I closed the empty pouch, folded it into my pocket, and went back up. I've done that every week since. I bring a new pouch. I had the first one refilled at a small shop I found that sells that kind of thing, run by a woman who didn't ask many questions and seemed to understand what I was asking for without much explanation. I pour a line at the threshold every Wednesday night when I do my boiler check. I do the check quickly. I stay on my side of the line. The dragging sound comes sometimes. Always from the far end, always from past the bend. It has not crossed the line. I don't know what Mr. Aldrich Bowen was. I don't know how long he'd been doing what he did or what he knew about the thing on the sublevel or where he learned it. I don't know if he was a patient or if being a patient was just the last thing he was before he died. I've thought about trying to find out more about him, searching his name, contacting the facility he was transferred to, asking questions. But some part of me knows that he told me what I needed to know and nothing more than that, and that there's a reason for the economy of that. People who know more about things like this don't always do better than people who know just enough. I still work the overnight shift. I still walk those floors between midnight and 7. The third-floor nurses are still the best company you can find at 4 in the morning, and the work is still quiet, honest, and invisible in a way I've come to appreciate more than I can explain. I replaced another bulb in room 214 last month. New patient, now a woman in her 70s recovering from a procedure. She was asleep when I came in. As I was leaving, she stirred and said without opening her eyes, "Be careful downstairs, sweetheart." I stopped. She didn't say anything else. Her breathing settled back into sleep rhythm. I stood there in the doorway for a moment looking at her, and then I let the door close softly behind me and I went back to work. The pouch is in my left breast pocket every night I come in. It was the first thing I checked when I left room 214 last month, standing in the hallway under the fluorescent hum. It was there, salt and ash. That was enough. We continue. I have been driving long-haul trucks for 11 years. I say that not to impress anyone because there is nothing glamorous about it. You spend more time alone on a dark highway than you do with people you actually care about. And after a while, the silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling like something is pressing on your chest. But I say it because I need you to understand that I am not someone who scares easily. I have driven through blizzards in Wyoming, through flash floods in Tennessee, through stretches of desert so empty that your headlights feel like the last 2 lights left on in the entire world. I have seen things on the road that most people would call terrifying, and I have always had an explanation for them. I don't have an explanation for what happened on Route 9 in October of last year. I'm not sure one exists. My name is Dale Morrow. I'm 43 years old and I've been based out of a small distribution hub in Barstow, California for most of my career. I haul refrigerated goods, mostly produce, dairy, occasionally medical supplies, nothing exotic. My route that night was a delivery run to a grocery distribution center in Flagstaff, Arizona. I had done that same run so many times that I could have drawn the highway from memory, every exit ramp, every mile marker, every particular stretch where the road dips and your stomach floats for just a second. It was the kind of route where your hands do the work and your mind goes somewhere else entirely. I left the depot at around 9 in the evening. October nights in the Mojave are cold in a way that catches people off guard. The days are still warm enough to fool you, but once the sun drops, the temperature follows fast. I had my coffee in the cup holder, my dispatch radio on low, and a playlist of old country music that I had been listening to for so many years it had stopped registering as sound and become something closer to background hum. Everything was normal for the first 2 hours. I passed through Needles, crossed into Arizona, and settled into that familiar rhythm that long-haul drivers know, not quite awake, not quite asleep, just moving. The road was nearly empty, which was not unusual for that hour on a weeknight. I maybe passed 3 or 4 vehicles the whole way through that stretch. It was somewhere around mile marker 74 that I first noticed the diner. Now I want to be precise about this because it matters. I had driven that route for years. I knew every gas station, every rest stop, every sad little roadside attraction between Barstow and Flagstaff. There was no diner at mile marker 74. There had never been a diner at mile marker 74. That stretch of Route 9 is absolutely nothing, scrubland and darkness and the occasional coyote sitting too close to the highway shoulder. But there it was, a low, flat building set back maybe 40 yards from the road, with a lit sign out front and a gravel parking lot with 2 or 3 vehicles in it. The sign said Martyrs in red neon letters, and underneath it in smaller lettering that I could barely make out as I passed, open all hours. I kept driving. I told myself it was a new place, that maybe it had opened recently and I had just missed it on previous runs. That was the rational explanation, and I held on to it for about 5 miles before I pulled over onto the shoulder and sat there with the engine idling. Here is the thing that I could not shake. The sign looked old, not new business old, not even a few years old. It looked like something that had been there for a generation, the kind of neon where the light flickers slightly on the vowels and the metal casing has that particular brown-orange oxidation that only comes from decades of desert air. That is not something you can fake, or at least not easily. And a sign like that, attached to a building I had never seen, on a road I had driven hundreds of times, that did not add up. I sat on the shoulder for maybe 3 minutes. Then I turned the truck around. I want to be honest about why. It was not curiosity alone, though that was part of it. I was also genuinely hungry. I had not eaten anything since a protein bar at 6 o'clock, and the coffee had long since gone cold. If there was a diner on that road, a real one, open at 11 at night, That was actually useful information. I told myself that I would go in, order something, make sure the place was real, and get back on the road. 20 minutes, half an hour at most. I had enough time in my schedule to absorb it. The gravel parking lot had 3 vehicles in it: a pickup truck with a cracked windshield, an older model sedan with no real license plate, and what appeared to be a van with the windows covered from the inside with what looked like newspaper. I noted all of this without thinking too hard about it, parked at the far end of the lot, and went inside. The interior of Marta's was exactly what the exterior had suggested: old, worn, but not unpleasant. Vinyl booths in a faded turquoise, a long counter with round stools bolted to the floor, fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly overhead. There was a pie case near the register with 3 pies in it, and the smell: eggs, coffee, bacon grease, something sweet underneath was so aggressively normal that I immediately felt better about the whole thing. The place smelled like every truck stop diner I had ever eaten in. It smelled like Tuesday mornings and overnight drives, and the particular exhaustion of middle age. There were 2 other customers at the counter, a woman in a green canvas jacket, maybe 60, with a cup of coffee in front of her that she wasn't drinking, and a man at the far end, heavy set, in a dark work shirt with his back to me. Neither of them looked up when I came in. The waitress appeared from the kitchen almost immediately. She was a young woman, mid-20s maybe, with her hair tied back and a small pen tucked behind her ear. Her uniform was the kind you don't see anymore, light pink with white collar, the sort of thing that looked like it came from a costume shop but on her looked entirely genuine. She smiled at me, handed me a laminated menu and said, "Sit anywhere you like." I took a booth near the window. The menu was short and handwritten in ink that had been photocopied so many times the letters had that particular blur to them. Coffee, eggs, toast, pancakes, a few sandwiches, a burger, simple. I ordered coffee and eggs over easy, and she wrote it down without repeating it back to me, which I have always found oddly professional. While I waited, I looked out the window at my truck sitting in the parking lot. The running lights were on, orange along the trailer roof, which was how I had left them. Something about seeing it out there was reassuring, a piece of my ordinary life parked just outside, available to me whenever I needed to leave. The coffee arrived first, and it was good. Better than it had any right to be out here, strong and clean, not the burned, ashy flavor that you get at highway stops where the pot has been sitting since 6 in the morning. I drank half of it before the eggs came, and when they arrived, they were exactly right, the whites fully set, the yolk still loose, the toast well browned. I remember thinking that I would have to look up this place online when I got home, that my dispatcher Marcus would get a kick out of hearing about a genuinely good diner on the Flagstaff run. It was somewhere in the middle of eating that I noticed the woman in the green jacket had not moved. Not shifted, not adjusted her coffee cup, not turned a page of a phone or a newspaper. She was simply sitting with both hands flat on the counter, her cup in front of her, facing forward. I watched her for a full minute and she did not blink, or if she did, I could not see it from my angle. I told myself she was tired, long-haul tired, the kind where your body is technically awake and your mind has gone somewhere else. I understood that state. I had been in it myself more times than I could count, but the man at the far end of the counter had not moved either. I ate more slowly after that. I tried to focus on my food, on the taste of it, on the normalcy of the transaction I was in the middle of. But I kept finding my eyes going back to the 2 figures at the counter, and neither of them moved the entire time I was sitting there. Not once. The waitress came back and refilled my coffee. I asked her casually how long the diner had been open. She smiled. "Oh, a long time," she said. "New to me," I said. "I drive this route pretty regularly." She tilted her head slightly. "People notice us when they need to," she said, which was an odd enough answer that I set down my fork. "What does that mean?" I asked. She just smiled again and said, "More coffee?" And I said no, I was fine, and she went back toward the kitchen. I finished eating. The eggs were still good, which I found almost irritating by that point. Everything about the food was exactly right, and everything about the place was not. I left enough cash on the table to cover the meal and a reasonable tip, and I stood up. The woman in the green jacket spoke without turning around. "Don't take the highway," she said. Her voice was flat, the way a voice sounds when the person using it is not fully present in the room. I stopped. "Excuse me?" "Don't take the highway back," she said. "Not tonight, not 9. I looked at the man at the far end of the counter. He still had not moved. "Are you talking to me?" I asked, which I realized immediately was a stupid question because there was no one else in the room. She didn't answer. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, and I could see from where I stood that the coffee in it was cold. There was no steam, not even the faint shimmer of a warm liquid. She had been sitting there with cold coffee in the same position for the entire time I had been in the diner. I left. I walked across the gravel parking lot, and I climbed into my truck and I locked the door behind me, which I do not normally do at a roadside stop. I sat there for a moment with the engine off and looked at the diner through the windshield. The neon sign buzzed. Marta's, open all hours. The parking lot was lit by a single floodlight on a wooden pole, and in that light the van with the newspaper-covered windows looked worse than it had when I arrived. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot and got back on the highway. I took Route 9. I want to say that I dismissed what the woman said because it was clearly the raving of someone who was not entirely well, because it was the rational thing to do, because I had a delivery to make and a schedule to keep. All of those things are true, but the honest answer is that I took Route 9 because I was scared of the alternative, because if I took her seriously, that meant the whole experience was something I needed to take seriously, and I was not ready to do that. I drove for about 20 minutes before I saw the lights. They were emergency lights, blue and red, strobing in the distance on the eastbound lane, my lane, heading toward Flagstaff. As I got closer, I could see a line of vehicles stopped in the road and a highway patrol officer directing traffic onto the shoulder. I slowed down and rolled my window down. "What happened?" I asked. The officer looked up at me. He was young, early 30s, with the particular expression of someone who has recently seen something that will take time to process. "Rockfall," he said. "Big one. Came down maybe half an hour ago. Took out about 40 yards of lane. No casualties. Fortunately, road was pretty empty." He waved me through and I drove past the cleanup operation slowly. There were boulders on the highway the size of refrigerators, and the pavement beneath them was crushed. The rock face on the hillside above was raw and pale where the material had broken away. It was a serious slide, the kind that, had I been driving at normal speed when it happened, I would not have been able to stop in time. The timestamp on my truck's dash clock said 11:47 p.m. I sat with that for a long moment. If I had not stopped at the diner, I would have been at that exact stretch of highway at approximately that exact time. I had been there for maybe 25-30 minutes, which placed me precisely at mile marker 74 when the rockfall happened. If I had not turned around, if I had not gone inside, if the food had not been good enough to linger over, the math was not comfortable. I told myself it was coincidence. I am still telling myself that 11 months later, though with less conviction each time. Here's the part I did not tell the highway patrol officer or Marcus or my ex-wife Linda when I called her the next morning and tried to explain why I was upset without actually explaining anything. Here is the part I have told exactly one other person, a driver named Phil who's been doing this for longer than I have and who listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I pulled onto the shoulder to let the officer wave me past the rockfall, I looked in my rearview mirror. Just a reflex, I checked my mirrors constantly on the road. Habit, training. I checked the mirror, and in the darkness behind my trailer I could see very faintly the red neon glow of a sign. I was 10 miles from where the diner had been. I know that road. I know every mile of it. There is nothing at that position, no buildings, no signs, no structures of any kind. I know what I saw. I know what the distance was. I watched it in the mirror for about 4 seconds before it went dark. The next day I drove back. I went in the morning in full daylight when everything is as it should be, when there are no shadows and no tricks and the desert just looks like the desert. I drove slowly from mile marker 70 to mile marker 80 in both directions and I looked for martyrs. There was no building, there was no gravel parking lot, there was no wooden pole with a floodlight. There was scrubland and rock and the highway stretching away in both directions, and the morning air was cold and clear and absolutely empty. I got out of my truck and walked the shoulder for a while. The soil at the side of the road was undisturbed. There were no tire tracks in the dirt, no tire channels in the gravel, no fragment of glass or concrete or neon tubing. Nothing, not even a depression in the soil where a foundation might once have been. I have not driven Route 9 since. I put in a request with dispatch to be reassigned to different runs, and Marcus, to his credit, did not push me for a reason. I have been doing a northern route through Nevada for the past few months, and it is quieter up there. and the silence has started to feel like silence again instead of pressure. But I think about the woman in the green jacket. I think about what she said, and the fact that she said it, and the cold coffee in her cup. I think about whether she was warning me or whether she was something else entirely, something I don't have the right vocabulary for. I think about the man at the far end of the counter who never moved and never turned around, and whether if he had turned around, there would have been a face. I think about the waitress who said that people notice the diner when they need to. I think she was right. I think I needed to that night, and I think the cost of that whatever debt gets created when a place like that does you a service is something I haven't finished paying yet. Last week, I was sitting in a rest stop off I-80 eating a sandwich from a gas station, which is as ordinary and unsupernatural a thing as a person can do. The woman at the table across from me was drinking coffee and reading something on her phone, and she was completely unremarkable in every way. When she stood up to leave, she looked at me and said, "Drive safe." People say that all the time. It means nothing usually. She was wearing a green canvas jacket. I sat there for a long time after she left. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself there are thousands of green jackets in the world, that the woman in the diner had not been supernatural or significant, that I had simply constructed a pattern out of two unrelated things the way human beings are wired to do because the alternative is less comfortable. I'm still in that rest stop, as a matter of fact. It's been 40 minutes and I can't quite make myself get back in the truck. I know I will. I always do. That's the thing about this job. The road doesn't care whether you're ready. It's just there waiting, and eventually you run out of reasons to stay parked. I'm almost out of reasons. We continue. I don't know how to explain what happened to me 3 years ago, and I'm not sure I fully understand it even now. I've gone over it in my mind so many times that the details have worn grooves into my brain, the way a truck tire wears into asphalt over years of the same route. But telling it is different from remembering it. Telling it means making it real again, and I've spent a long time trying to convince myself it wasn't. My name is Marcus Webb. I've been driving long-haul freight since I was 23 years old. I'm 38 now, and I want to be clear about something before I start. I'm not a man who believes in ghosts. I wasn't raised that way. My father was a mechanic. My mother worked the register at a hardware store in Beaumont, Texas, and between the two of them, they raised 3 kids who understood that the world worked on logic and diesel fuel and not much else. We didn't go to church. We didn't talk about things we couldn't see. When something scared us, my father would find a rational explanation for it, and we believed him because he was always right. But my father has been dead for 6 years now, and there are things I've seen on the road that he couldn't explain, that nobody can explain. I need to start earlier though, because this story doesn't begin with me. It begins with my brother Danny. Danny was 4 years younger than me, which made him 19 when it happened. He was the kind of kid who never quite fit inside the life our family had built for itself, too restless for the town, too loud for the house, always looking for something just beyond the edge of wherever he was standing. He wasn't a bad person, I want to say that clearly. He made bad decisions the way young men sometimes do when they have too much energy and not enough direction, but he wasn't bad. He was just Danny, all sharp corners and nervous laughter, always borrowing my truck without asking and somehow always returning it with a full tank. Like that made everything square. When I was 22, Danny got involved with a group of men I didn't like. I won't go into who they were or what exactly they did because none of that is the point. The point is that one night Danny drove out to a property on the edge of Hardin County, a stretch of piney woods that locals called the Greer Tract, named after a family that had owned the land since the 40s and slowly let it go wild, and he didn't come back. They found his truck parked at the shoulder of the fire road that cut through the property. The engine was off. His phone was still in the cup holder. His boots, and this is the detail that stayed with me, that burrowed into the back of my skull and never left his boots, were sitting neatly on the passenger seat side by side like he'd taken them off before stepping out. They searched the Greer Tract for 11 days. Game wardens, volunteers, 2 different sheriff's departments. My mother drove up from Beaumont and sat in a folding chair outside the command tent they'd set up at the fire road entrance, and she didn't leave for 4 days, not even to sleep, until my father finally convinced her that she was going to make herself sick. They never found Danny. No body, no evidence, nothing. The men he'd been running with were questioned and released. The investigators said there was no sign of violence, no sign of anything at all. One of the search volunteers, an older man named Gerald, who'd been part of these operations his whole life, told my father privately that he'd never seen a disappearance like it. The dogs had tracked Danny's scent from the truck to a dry creek bed about a quarter mile into the woods, and then nothing, like he'd been lifted straight up off the ground. My father filed that information away under things he couldn't explain and never mentioned it again. I was less disciplined about it. For years after Danny disappeared, I drove past the Greer Tract entrance every time I passed through Hardin County. Not because I expected to find anything. Not because I had a plan. I just needed to look at it. The way you press on a bruise to remind yourself it still hurts. The fire road sign was sun-faded and half obscured by overgrowth. Sometimes I'd slow down. Once I pulled off and sat there with the engine idling for 20 minutes before I convinced myself to keep going. The grief didn't disappear, it calcified. That's the best word I have for it. It became something hard and permanent inside my chest, and I learned to work around it the way you learn to walk with a stone in your shoe. I got my CDL at 23, the year after Danny vanished, and I've been driving ever since. Long haul mostly, refrigerated loads down to the valley, machinery parts up to the Permian Basin, dry freight across to New Mexico and back. I like the work for reasons that are hard to explain to people who haven't done it. There's a particular kind of quiet you find at 2 a.m. on an empty interstate, when the radio is low and the road is just a pale ribbon of light unspooling in front of you. Your mind goes somewhere between thinking and not thinking. The grief goes quiet too, for a while. I was doing a run for a plastics distributor out of Houston, headed north with a full load toward a warehouse outside Texarkana. It was late October, early in the week, and a line of weather had moved through that afternoon and knocked out the usual route options. A section of I-69 was backed up due to flooding near Livingston, and dispatch had sent me an alternative. Take US 190 east to pick up State Highway 63, then cut north through Jasper County to get back on the interstate above the flooding. I'd driven that stretch before years ago. I didn't think anything of it. I made the turn onto 63 just before 10 at night. The storm had cleared and the sky was that particular shade of washed clean black you sometimes get after a hard rain, every star sharp and cold and slightly too bright. The road was mostly empty, an occasional pickup going the other direction, headlights sweeping past me, and then nothing. I was somewhere around the Hardin County line, I know, because I'd glanced at the GPS when I saw the boy. He was standing at the shoulder of the road about 50 yards ahead of me in the cone of my headlights, barefoot. That was the first thing I noticed. He was standing on the wet asphalt in bare feet, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans, and he was facing me, not flagging me down, just standing there watching me approach. I slowed down. When you're driving a rig and you see someone on foot at the side of a rural highway at 10 o'clock at night, you slow down. You have to. The kid couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. I pulled over about 20 yards past him and hit my hazards. I looked in my side mirror and saw him still standing there, not moving toward the truck, just watching. I lowered my window. "Hey," I called out, "you need help?" He didn't answer. He just turned his head slightly, like he was looking at something in the dark trees to the left of the road. I put the truck in park and climbed out. The air smelled like wet pine and something underneath it, faint and sour that I couldn't identify. I walked back toward the kid. My boots were loud on the asphalt. "You okay?" I said. "Where are your shoes?" He turned to look at me then, and I stopped walking. His face was fine, normal, dark eyes, a little wide, the look of a kid who'd been outside too long and was trying not to show that he was scared. Nothing wrong with the face. But when I looked down at his feet, there was something in his right hand hanging at his side that I hadn't seen from the truck. He was holding a pair of boots, small boots, lace-up work boots, brown leather with the toe worn pale. They were the boots my brother Danny had been wearing the night he disappeared. I know how that sounds. I know there's no rational way I could have recognized a pair of boots I hadn't seen in 16 years, from a distance, at night, on a rural highway. I know that, but I did. I knew them the same way you know a person's laugh before you can see their face. Some things just land in you at a frequency below logic. I stood there and the kid just watched me holding those boots. "Where did you get those?" I said. My voice came out very flat and very quiet. He didn't answer. He looked back toward the trees, and then he walked off the shoulder into the grass, and then into the trees, and I watched him go until the dark closed around him. I don't know how long I stood there. When I got back in the truck, my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to grip the steering wheel for a few minutes before I could drive. I called dispatch and told them I was taking a 30-minute rest break, a mechanical issue, nothing serious. I didn't tell them what I'd actually seen. There was no version of that conversation that ended well for me. I've thought about that kid 1,000 times since then. Whether he was real, whether I hallucinated the whole thing out of exhaustion and proximity to a road I'd been dreading for years without letting myself admit it. The explanation I keep coming back to, the one that makes the most clinical sense, is that I fell asleep at the wheel for a fraction of a second. It happens, even to experienced drivers, even when you think you're wide awake, and what I saw was the tail end of a micro-sleep, a dream fragment spliced into the real world. That would explain the boy. It doesn't explain what happened 2 hours later. I'd made it back to the interstate by then, northbound on I-369, heavy traffic even at midnight, the kind of density that keeps you focused and alert. I was feeling better, more grounded. I'd stopped at a gas station in Jasper, bought coffee and a candy bar, stood outside in the cold for 5 minutes until my head cleared. By the time I merged onto the interstate, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been exactly what the rational explanation said. It was a micro-sleep, a dream, nothing more. I was about 40 miles south of Texarkana when the radio cut out. Not static, not a signal drop, it just stopped. Mid-song, silence, and the display on my radio unit went dark. Then my GPS rerouted. I watched the screen recalculate without touching anything. The new route took me off the interstate at the next exit and sent me onto a county road I didn't recognize, County Road 9, no town name attached, no markers I knew. I looked at it and didn't follow it. I stayed on the interstate and took the regular exit toward the warehouse district, the one I'd used before, and I made the delivery without incident. The dispatcher signed off on my paperwork, and I drove to the rest area on the south end of Texarkana to sleep before the return trip. I didn't sleep. I lay in the cab with the curtain drawn and stared at the ceiling and thought about Danny and bare feet and a pair of boots hanging from a child's hand in the dark. I thought about the fire road entrance with the faded sign and the 11-day search and the dogs losing the trail at the creek bed. I thought about my father saying, the way he said everything, "Let it go, Marcus, let it go," and I thought about how I had never once managed to do that. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, I picked up my phone and looked up County Road 9 in Bowie County. It was a real road, a 7-mile stretch running east of the interstate through scrub and timberland. It terminated at a property boundary. I looked at the satellite image for a long time. The road just ended. Nothing at the terminus but trees. I should have driven home. Instead, at 6:30 in the morning in grey pre-dawn light with fog still sitting in the low places, I drove out County Road 9. It was unpaved after the first half mile, and my rig had no business being on it. I kept my speed down and my hazards on, watching the road ahead and telling myself I'd turn around at the first sign it was getting worse. The road got worse almost immediately, ruts and standing water and a soft shoulder that could have swallowed a tire, but I kept going. I don't have a good explanation for that. I know only that I felt like something was pulling me forward, not literally, not the way people sometimes describe these things, but in the way that grief pulls you back to a place even when you know there's nothing left there. About 4 miles in, I came around a bend and my headlights hit something in the road. A pair of boots, sitting upright in the center of the road side by side like they'd been placed there deliberately. Brown leather work boots, lace up, the toe worn pale. I stopped the truck. I sat there for a long time with the engine running, looking at those boots in my headlights. The fog moved around them. The road beyond them disappeared into the gray. I got out. I walked up to them and stood there looking down at them. And I knew before I touched them. The same way I'd known the night before that they were Danny's. The left boot had a hairline crack in the leather above the ankle that I remembered because Danny had complained about it the week before he disappeared, saying he needed new boots, asking if I could spot him $20. I told him to get a job. It was one of the last conversations we had. I've never forgiven myself for the tone of my voice. I crouched down and picked them up. They weren't wet, even though the road around them was dark with moisture. The leather was dry and supple. They smelled faintly of grease and cedar, the same smell Danny's truck had carried. A combination of the cedar air freshener he used and the machine oil he'd never quite washed off his hands. I held those boots, and I didn't cry, which surprised me. I just crouched in that road in the gray fog and held them, and somewhere in the pines around me something moved, not an animal sound, a human sound. The sound of feet on soft ground, slow and deliberate, walking a wide circle around the truck. I stood up. "Danny," I said. My voice came out almost casual, which was strange, but I think by that point something had moved past fear in me and into a country I don't have a name for. The footsteps stopped. I waited. The fog shifted, and for a moment, and I want to be careful here because I don't know what I actually saw, and I don't know how much of it was the light and the fog and 16 years of accumulated grief pressing on my perception. I thought I saw a shape between the pines, about 30 yards off the road, standing still, the size and rough outline of a grown man. It didn't move. I didn't move. We stood there, whatever it was, and I, for what felt like a long time. Then the fog closed again, and it was gone. I carried those boots back to my truck. I put them on the passenger seat. I drove back down County Road 9 and got on the interstate and drove home to Beaumont, and I didn't stop once. I still have the boots. They're in a box in my closet, and I haven't opened it since the night I brought them home. I've thought about taking them to someone, a grief counselor, a pastor, someone, and trying to explain it, but every time I work out how that conversation would go, I stop. My mother cried when I told her. She held my hands across the kitchen table and cried, and then she said something I've thought about every day since. She said that some of the people we lose don't know they're supposed to let go of us. That the holding on goes both ways, and sometimes the person doing the leaving is just as lost as the person being left. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what I believe about what moves in the dark at the end of unmarked roads or what form grief takes when it's had 16 years to become something else. What I know is this: I still drive the same routes, and I still pass the Greer Tract entrance a few times a year, and I still slow down when I do. But now, when I look at that fire road sign half buried in overgrowth, I don't feel the same thing I used to feel. It's not peace exactly, but it's something close to it, like two people who have been searching for each other in the dark, and one of them has finally stopped walking long enough for the other one to find him.